We don't talk at each other.
Exactly.
Well said. I agree. And the least among us, the least learned among us has an opportunity to learn. And I love it, Rick. Because I am the least among us. I am among that group.
I was about to say thank you for that. No, that I had an opportunity.
Joe's hate.
That
Joe's
I'm the,
hate.
yeah. No, that I'm the least that I have an opportunity to learn.
Yes.
Well, we all bring stuff to it, right? And is part of the advantage of, and I say this, I always wish that Kenneth was available to join us, but it's sort of the advantage of not having him here is that his text is the frame of reference that we're sort of working around. And so none of us gets to feel like we're being attacked by criticism or questions or discussions. It's Kenneth's text, right? So we're sort of we're trying to figure out what he's talking about. We're trying to figure out what the philosophers he's referring to are talking about. It's a collaborative effort as we all sort of work to explore these ideas. It's a lot better than somebody standing up and saying, "I shall now pronounce my undying truths," and oh my God, how dare you question me? It sets up a bad dynamic. So, but we'll engage and see if he's interested in a real dialogue.
But questioning is one of the fundamental parameters for learning. So
Yeah.
there's never a stupid question.
Yeah.
Never.
Or to put it another way, it's okay if questions are stupid. I mean, we're people, right? We don't know everything. We don't know which are the smart things and the stupid things. We're just exploring this stuff together.
Yeah, and stupid implies that you are being judgmental. That's why it's never stupid. Ask it. Because the only stupid question is the one you don't ask.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll reach out to him and see if he's interested in it.
Yeah, I was gonna say one thing about a guy like this, if he is, let's say, not in the right of intentions and doesn't realize that he's perhaps a bad actor, the only type of stupid questions are those from people who are trying to purposely gaslight or hurt someone. Basically, they're not asking they're pretending to pose a question when they're actually doing something else. And so one thing again I really like about this space that Rick you seem to foster really nicely is encouraging people to really be genuine and be good actors. And instead of people like fighting at each other's weak points in their arguments.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, none of us can make an argument that is immune to being picked apart. We're mortals. It's, there's not going to be any perfect statement coming from any of us. So if we want to spend our time playing the game of, haha, I just proved you're immortal, well, that's boring. The end result is always the same. Yes, we're mortals. Yes, we blunder. Congratulations. You managed to arrive on planet Earth with the rest of us.
Right.
But, the question is, what can we explore in our erroneous but very curious way? So anyway, for those just joining us, we are continuing the Kenneth Smith seminar. Oh, yeah, I'll call on Stephen in just a second. We're continuing our Kenneth Smith seminar. We're doing a multi-year arc. So far, it's been 2 years, and my estimate right now is that it might last at least 4 and probably 6 years to work our way through Millennia and Microcosm. And the reason it takes that time is that Kenneth Smith writes in a very dense, allusive style. His usage of language is very interesting. He's not using big words to show off that he knows big words. He's using precise words to try to step out of the modern interpretive framework. He's trying to show us how we can look at the world from different angles, and that requires very careful use of language, and it requires understanding when by the word soul do we mean the modern definition, when do we mean the medieval definition, when do we mean the ancient definition, when do we mean some other definition. That ability to take the same set of words and put different sets of meanings on them that represent these different time frames and perspectives. This is an interesting game he's trying to teach us to play. So we're taking our time, we're unpacking this. The other thing is, because his style is so elusive, this isn't a me book. This is a them book. He's pointing to Aristotle, he's pointing to Hegel, he's pointing to Thomas Aquinas, and he's encouraging us to explore them for ourselves and see, is he correct when he says that Aristotle thinks that sophrosune is the neatest thing since sliced bread? Is he correct when he says that Aquinas's big contribution to the church is that he's trying to get the medieval church to take Aristotle and the real world seriously and allow for science to engage with to exist within the framework of the church without being some kind of heresy. He makes these claims, but he doesn't hide them. He says, this is what I think, and so and so meant by this, and go read it for yourself. Decide if you think I'm right. And if you think I'm wrong, cool, move on. Find some, investigate, learn. He's basically a philosophy course dressed up as a book. He's pretending to have written a book when he's actually just pointing at the whole history of Western civilization and philosophy. So it's very interesting stuff to unpack, and we're taking our time with it. The other thing is, there's no point in rushing through this so that we can check off and say, look, we did a thing, and then but have got to the end and not understood half of what we saw, and have been confused and didn't get to ask our questions, and if we had a problem, we didn't get to say what our problem was. There's no point in that. What is that? I mean, that's just, we've all got busy lives. We don't need to just check off more boxes. The modern world give us plenty of boxes to check. So we're taking our time with this. And chapter 4, I think, will win the record for this seminar of the greatest amount of time spent on a single chapter. And that's because the medieval section and the modern section, he gives many chapters apiece to, but the ancient section, he does it in a single chapter. And that's because he taught ancient philosophy so many times, he had it down pat. He could just nail the main points. But the result was it was a very dense chapter, and it took us a long time to pick apart what is he saying here? What are the implications? Where are we going with this? So for those of you who are joining us now, we're in the medieval section. And it begins with chapter 5 of this book. I put the link in the chat. It's also available in the invite on Meetup. And anytime you want to, you can go back and read the first 3 introductory chapters, or you can read chapter 4 and take your time, breaking it down and working out what he's saying. You can look at the past videos on YouTube if there's any that you want to. And my God, 2 years of videos on the previous parts of this book. I understand if not everybody wants to do that. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's our cup of tea. It's our jam, and we're gonna enjoy it. So we're in chapter 5. We're starting the medieval section. He's introducing the core tenets of the medieval worldview, and he's introducing them specifically in contrast to the ancient worldview, which we've just spent all that time on in chapter 4. So even if you missed chapter 4, this is a great place to come in, because we're both introducing the medieval concepts, and for people who missed the earlier stuff, we're introducing the ancient concepts so we can put them in juxtaposition and say, see how different this is. Look at what a revolution in thinking this is. It's not just the clock ticked and it's another day. This was a deliberate, to use Hegel's terminology, a deliberate negation of the worldview and value system of the ancient world. And they really didn't miss a point. All the major parts of the ancient worldview and value system were turned on their head by the medievals. And the result of we basically replaced a notion in which nature was preeminent and the gods were subordinate to and or expressions of nature, and humanity was subordinate to both of the above. That was the ancient worldview. We replaced that with a world in which nature is dethroned and God is left on the top. And instead of a bunch of gods, it's a single God. They're collected together. All the aspects of Apollo and Artemis and all the rest of them are now pushed together into a single being without the limitations of the previous bunch. And this completely changes everything. Why do we live? How do we decide what's important? What does a good life look like? Can you trust human judgment? I mean, all these core ideas have been changed because of the new framework. So we're just getting into that. We're now getting into paragraph 5 of chapter 5. But as is our wont, we will probably be hopping back and forth between the earlier chapters and the earlier paragraphs. So before we proceed, I think that's our intro for now. Before we proceed, Steve, and you're off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I've been looking up Spengler lately, and he has this view of various civilizations. We've been talking about what we call the ancient civilization, the civilization of the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans. And he's saying that culture will go through 4 phases. There's a stage of infancy. It's organic, of course, as with Polybius. There's a stage of infancy. There's a stage of youth. Then there's a stage of maturity, which materially and philosophically seems to be the most valuable. And that's followed by a stage of old age. And for the Greco-Roman era, the very point in time which historians view as the grandest, for Spengler was old age. That was the Rome of the Caesars. It was philosophically unuseful. As you said, we've jumped over it. We looked at the Greek philosophers we looked at the youth of the Greco culture. You know, we had the Trojan War, the youthful folly. Oh, sorry, I mean the infancy. I think that stage was for Spengler, a transition between the infancy of Grecian culture and the youth. And then we have the mature phase with the rise of the classical Greeks. And there's a great deal of innovation in philosophy and whatever. Then we got the Rome of the Caesars takeover, where everything's laid down in stone. There's no great growth anymore. And the medieval worldview is what was growing in that tomb. And eventually that tomb falls away. We get the Dark Ages, which Spengler would qualify as another period of youth of our culture. Then the High Middle Ages was the youth of our culture. And then modern times was the maturity, where this new Western culture extends across the world, has a very innovative technology and a very innovative philosophies. Now, he claimed presently our culture, and remember, he's claiming the medieval culture is still our culture, is entering its Caesar phase. It is entering its old age. So what we've been talking about, the message of Christianity, whoever created it, Jesus or all the monks and Christians later on who altered the story, developed a new world vision in the midst of the tomb of the old culture, which for us was the glorious Rome of the emperors. And the western part, or even the eastern part, the western part falls to bits. And it's in the ashes of this culture that the new West starts to arise. So that's just the view I've sort of been building up from what I can see of Spengler. Very roughly put. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. For those joining us, I'd like to underscore a couple of things about what Stephen said. And one of them is, the whole premise of Kenneth Smith's book is that the struggle to figure out who has the right idea is doomed to failure. And it's doomed to failure because we're mortals. And being mortal, we don't live that long. We don't get to experience much of the cosmos. There are enormous limits on human knowledge. And as a result, all of the great systems that we propose for how to understand everything are inherently flawed. And so the best thing that we can do is, rather than try to find the one true set of ideas and attach ourselves to it, as an orthodoxy, it's to learn to modulate between different perspectives. And so we want to collect models and learn what they're good for and what they're bad at, and figure out when to shift from one model to another. The toolkit, model, rather than having the man with the hammer who thinks everything's a nail. So part of what Stephen's doing that's a benefit here is that he's bringing forward Spengler's alternative way of categorizing history as a not in opposition to, but as an adjunct to the sort of default one that Kenneth is using here in the book, which is based on Hegel. And it's important to collect multiple perspectives on this, because none of us knows the history well enough to give an authoritative statement that says this is exactly how it was. We're all just trying to model it in different ways. So I'm going to offer a third one that Kenneth has recommended before that people might find interesting. It's by Emile Brechir, and that link is broken. Sorry about that. You'll have to go to Wikipedia and look at Emile Brechir. But Brechir wrote I think it's a 7-volume history of philosophy. that Kenneth likes a lot. It's on his list of his lifetime reading list. And one of the things that Brehir helped me understand is that between the Greek period and the Roman period, you have this Hellenistic period. He distinguishes the Hellenic from the Hellenistic, and the Hellenic is what Stephen was saying. Spengler calls the classical era of Greece, and then after that, he puts the Hellenistic period, which is started with Philip of Macedon conquering Greece and his son Alexander, then wielding together with a new Koine Greek and leading them to create a great empire, which falls apart pretty quickly upon Alexander's death. But the broken pieces of the Alexandrian Empire continue for centuries. And this is the era of the Library of Alexandria, for example. And Brehir's argument is that, and this builds on Spengler, you can see the relationship to Spengler with what I'm about to say. There's the Hellenic period has this boldness, and Kenneth Smith calls it an audacity. You read Heraclitus, and he is not tiptoeing around topics hoping that nobody disproves him. He's just making enormous, bold claims about the nature of human understanding and the cosmos and how it's all organized and so forth. And Kenneth Smith says that's typical of the Hellenic period, and Brehir makes that argument as well. He says, but in the Hellenistic period, there's a shift to a kind of timidity, and the timidity takes the specific form of that you could think of as represented by the Library of Alexandria. So rather than coming up with new ideas of our own, not that nobody does, but rather than focusing on having new ideas, we want to collect all the ideas everybody's already had and catalog them and learn how to describe their manuscripts and come up with organizational systems for all the scrolls in the library and so forth. There's an enormous amount of, I guess Kenneth sort of refers to it as a kind of academicism, focusing on the study of what other people have thought and written, rather than being the one to go out and do the thinking. Anybody who's engaged in modern scientific scholarship knows there's a cross between the two that's needed. You want to go out and explore ideas, but you also don't want to be the idiot who goes out and invents the wheel for the 7,000th time and says, behold, I've made a new thing. It's like, it would be helpful to know that other people have in fact already made a wheel, but you'd have to actually look at the literature. And so, a critical part of any real scientific study is what's called the literature review, where you're expected to walk people through what are the essential points of the previous scientific literature that led up to your point of departure, where you're going to go forth and do some exploration. So you can think of, in some ways, the Hellenic period is the period that sort of neglected literature review and focused on the bold experiments, and the Hellenistic period sort of neglected the bold experiments but focused on literature review. And it's an interesting distinction Brehir is making. Of course, by the time you get to the Romans, there's a whole lot less curiosity. I mean, as we've talked about in previous sessions, the Roman culture was hostile to intellectualism. I mean, they enslaved Greek scholars and then used them to teach their kids, right? I'm gonna get me one of them smart guys to make my kids smart. There's this kind of mafioso, I need somebody to decorate up the place and make some fancy speeches kind of thing to the Romans. Kenneth refers to them as the mafia of the ancient world. So, you can talk about the ancient epoch as one epoch. You can talk about it as broken down into parts. Spengler makes some splits, Brehir makes some splits, other people make some splits. There's a lot of ways to do this, but kind of regardless of where we draw the lines, one of the things that we're exploring here in this book is this Hegelian idea, which is based on the ancient Greek idea that we model the epochs not as lines on a timeline, but as organisms that arise and have their own forces that hold them together. So that even when Lenin tries to revolt against the modern order, which he, in his mind, is capitalism, he ends up creating a society that less than 100 years later is back to capitalism again. There's an arc when you're inside of an epoch where your thinking is framed in ways you can't see. And those frames are based on subtle but important aspects of how we imagine ourselves, imagine the world, imagine nature. And even when we try to rebel, if we're using the tools of the epoch to do it with, we don't end the epoch. We just extend it further. And our arc bends back into, the preconceptions that we're based upon. This is sort of Kenneth Smith's kind of idea that he's exploring here, which he got from Hegel and and a lot of others. And there's no reason why that can't be applied. When you hear Stephen's description of Spengler's, the youth, the infancy, the youth period, the flourishing, the old age. This is again the Hegelian concept of periods of time as organisms, and all of this comes straight out of the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks. In chapter 4, we said one of the most fundamental things about the Greek worldview is that they didn't see the universe as a place full of stuff the way we do. We see it as a place full of stuff, and we want to get the stuff to make ourselves powerful and rich, or manipulate our environment and have control. But the ancients didn't see it that way. They saw it as a gigantic organism that holds itself together, and it's made up of other organisms that have to find harmony with each other and so forth. So these concepts, this is where all of this stuff is rooted in this book. Sharon, you had your hand up for a while. Do you want to say something?
I was going to ask a question, but I noticed that I guess I left early last week, because in the previous paragraph, the preceding paragraph, I wanted to know how you interpreted this, where Kenneth Smith says this concept of supernatural divinity has bound the thinking of Christians to its own absolutist and abstractivist logic. And I thought those were some pretty profound words. So I wanted to know how you interpreted that. Because one of the things I thought about is that this absolutist and abstractivist logic in the supernatural divinity was manifested as Christians in the Middle Ages and other cultures in the Middle Ages building these huge edifices of worship. And so I wanted to know if my interpretation of that was correct. Just a simple question.
I think that's a great question, Sharon, and that'll be useful for Donna too, since she wasn't here last week. So I think it's useful for us to take a step back and look at that. Before I do that, I'd like to call on Joe, because I think Joe's responding to the current topic. And so if we have Joe speak, then we can finish that up, and then we can take some time looking at paragraph 4 and what we talked about last week, if you're game. Does that sound,
yes,
that sound
okay.
good, Sharon?
Yes,
Okay.
that's perfect.
Okay, let's do that. So Joe, come off mute, tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll come back to Sharon.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to see about, the way Stephen actually characterized the way cultures rise and fall, essentially. And I think that one thing that you'd started out, Rick, with stating essentially that when we start to think that there's one right answer to everything, one system that's actually going to be the cure-all, is kind of the problem to begin with. So that what you need is something that can evolve. Now, one of the things that I think that's actually essential in that process is, as you rightly stated, is that something where you don't want a system where you're kind of reinventing the wheel all the time, right? I'm thinking something like Easter Island, where you're stuck on the island and it's like, oh, wow, this is not working. But you want to maintain the integrity of the local cultures itself. So then I think that that's where it kind of calls for a system that is able to go through an evolutionary process, but has a set of principles, at least, that it falls back on. And so that there's the flexibility for an evolution for, locally. But at the same time, it's not necessarily just everybody's coming up with it's not chaos either. So there's some degree of order in the universe, so to speak. And I only say that because I think that that's actually a really important point, and even modern economics, especially, is one of the ideas of how information travels is actually a really important thing to consider when we're talking about that. Because then how do you then collaborate or use information locally and still maintain the local integrity of the culture, like meaning everybody's sharing the ideas. And you can say that the internet's part of that evolution, right? But part of the problem is the noise that's actually involved in that. So then how do you validate, what is actually good information and what's not? And I think that that's something where the way information travels and the way it's used and the way local systems are managed may actually kind of not necessarily fall into the same framework that Spangler had come up with. Because I think one of the problems is that there's this need to expand continuously. And the need for expansion, whether it be Roman Empire or whatever it may be, Greece or whatever, you're expanding for resources, right? And those resources and that constant expansion kind of ultimately leads to, this is the system that we're going with. This is the system that works. And this is how we're going to necessarily, and that breaks down. Almost like I would say the equivalent thereof would be something like too big to fail, right? And so, but it does fail at some point, right? And so, so what you want is the ability for not having to expand, but to benefit from the information that comes with, kind of the ability to, that comes with multiple cultures. I would just say that. And so I think that it may not fit into that model as long as there isn't this continuous need to expand, so to speak. And that I think is a really, that need is partly due to, for, resources, obviously, but information is a resource. And so I think that that's where it may not necessarily fit into the typical model, because when we're talking about civilizations expanding. And then, yeah, I think that that's problematic. But I think that if things managed on a local level and how information travels actually can maybe have, they'll go through their own iterations. And I don't think those iterations will be as catastrophic, because when the fall happens, whether it be the USSR, the Roman Empire, whatever it may be, that's a hard fall. But when it's not necessarily an entire continent, that's actually maybe not nearly as catastrophic. So it's interesting to think about things in those terms, because again, this is coming back to exactly what Kenneth is talking about, this idea in general, is that, when we start to think that we have all the answers and that there's only one way of kind of doing things in this, and almost I would say this militaristic approach to kind of systems, as opposed to having a system that is actually adaptable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can see the arc from revolution to youth to flourishing to decay, very much in terms of the, during the period of revolution and youth, you're innovative because you're trying to cast off the old system, and the old system has all of the establishment behind it, and so you're questioning everything. You're there at that point, as far as you're open to try anything else because you hate the current system so much. I mean, Augustine, city of God, right? Rome, the city of man, is so rotten and corrupt. He's like, anything but this. Let's see what we can find out there that gives us an alternative. Hey, how about God? It's that search for getting out from under the status quo. But the problem is, when you succeed, you get into that flourishing period where everything seems to be going swimmingly. And so people begin to accumulate power. And the power is based on investment in the current world order. And when that starts happening, people start getting a lot less interested in having you question the current status quo because all their careers are based on that. Or their wealth or everything that they identify themselves as is based in not changing things too much. And so the period when an epoch seems to be doing its best is the period when it loses its ability to respond well. And as it loses that ability to respond well, it ends itself. It moves into the senescence and decay period because now it lacks that. What's that word semathesy that Nora Bateson coined for us. That thing that organisms have where they're in a perpetual learning relationship with the world around them. And so they pay attention to what's happening. And when conditions change, they change. And that's what makes an amoeba able to solve a maze, right? Is it's paying attention. But we get to the point where there's an increasing number of things you're not allowed to question because somebody's wealth is on the line. And then the result is that there's an increasing number of events in the real world that you can't adapt to. And so you start to become blind, or I guess blind isn't the right word. We start to become less like an amoeba and more like a stone. We don't notice the rain falling. We don't notice the temperature going up and down. It happens and it affects us, but we don't take into account the changes that ought to be made at that moment because we're more opposed to the change than we are worried about the long-term consequences. And I mean, we see that around us right now, right? With how many of our corporations and government agencies can't adapt because there's too much at stake with the way things are now. They're rigid, they get stuck. So
Yeah, and I'll just
that had to be what it was like.
really, yeah,
Sorry,
just
go ahead,
really
Joe.
quickly, one last thing is that, that ability, again, to change, that incentive, is based on power, again, the structure itself.
Yeah.
So that creative destruction, which inevitably comes, is basically happening at a much higher, with much higher stakes involved, and then the fall again becomes that much more problematic. And so
Yes.
that it takes away from the ability of an adaptable system. So that cycle that you actually want to be able to speed up, the ability to adapt, without necessarily kind of having, to have open heart surgery for everything that you do. In other words,
Right.
the cost isn't so high,
Yes.
So that's essentially, you're looking for the systems to be able to, kind of adjust. And I think that's one of those where you're not going to come up with a silver bullet that's, hey, this is the answer that we've been waiting for. And so,
Right.
and that's where it's saying, and anyway, and then those power structures actually are mitigated, and change is able to happen at a more rapid rate and a more meaningful rate too.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Um,
Hi, Donna.
Hi, sorry, I'm looking around for the hand and I couldn't find it. So I'm glad this is being talked about right now because just want to tell you, I act more on the ground and, in publishing articles in the papers and going to planning board meetings, et cetera. And I'm in a blue state with a rapidly red, council environment. And I'm seeing this. I'm seeing the rapid changes within my own country, and I know you're talking at a level that I'm not dealing with. I'm really getting down into the down and dirty of my community, but I see this happening, and I'm in a quandary how to deal with it. Right now I'm going through the back door as opposed to being confrontational with my red environment, and you know what I mean by red and blue in the United States. And this is helping me, to get out of that conflictual area and see it with new perspective. But I still don't know how to act in city councils and planning board meetings and, responding in the local paper, etc. So if anybody has any advice, other than this helps me to listen to this.
Thank you, Donna. I'm glad it's helpful. Even though if it's not immediately applicable, and that's one of the things that we conclude a lot about philosophy is Kenneth Smith's line on philosophy is every other discipline gives you something new to think about. Only philosophy gives you something new to think with, but it doesn't give you the answers. It's just a new,
Yeah,
an
very
odd way
good.
so, when it comes to this stuff, what's useful is seeing the way that, and we'll explore this, but seeing the way that people can be 100% trapped within a worldview and be 100% unaware that they're trapped. And the argument that he's making in here is that this book is an exercise in trying to practice putting on two alternative worldviews and using them to look back at modernity so that we can, for the first time, be the fishies that look around us and go, "Oh my goodness, this is we're swimming in water." It's like that saying about we don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. This is the critique of what it's like to be modern and to try to understand, well, what does that mean really in terms of the limits on our thinking and our perception of the world? And what it means is that we're not aware of the limits. We think that we see the world objectively and that we're free. We relentlessly talk about freedom, how free we are, or how free we should be, or and in all of that, there's no recognition of the cycles of generational trauma, cycles of generational alcoholism, cycles of generational violence, all these things that we're caught in repeating without being aware that they're happening because we take for granted the conditions that led to their arising. So where does this all lead in terms of our lives and how we can apply this stuff? Well, I don't know yet. I mean, I have that feeling that it leads to something pretty important, but I haven't put it all together. I don't think any of us has put it all together yet, but we can sort of see how Daedalus could be trapped in the labyrinth that he himself built until he learned to think in the third dimension that the labyrinth had never been designed to trap people in. And that's when he could fly out of the labyrinth and escape. But until that moment, he could never get out because the mere act of traversing the labyrinth extended the labyrinth. It's the metaphor for thinking. It's the metaphor for a worldview. The more you think using the tools of a worldview, the more the worldview grows around you and traps you even more deeply within it. It becomes a justification of itself. After all, it worked, right? I mean, I paid my rent successfully, so Sharon, go ahead.
I just wanted to say in response to Donna and in response to some of what you're saying, and it's a question. I think eras, civilizations, time thrive or not based on the people, the thinking of the people. And that's one of the faults of democracy. And whenever the ruling class gets to the point where power and absolute power replaces the common good, then we're in for significant change. And that change only benefits the powerful class, not the people. I don't know if that's a significant comment, Donna, but that's the way I see it. When power and absolute power is the be all and the end all, then the common good goes out the door.
Yeah. I mean, Nietzsche says power makes stupid. And he's not just insulting power. He's like, when you have power, you use it as a shortcut to solve problems without really solving them. Like when a corporation is trying to make a deadline so that it can make more money, and it says, you know what, I'd like you to cut some corners here and there. And you can get away with that for a while, but there comes a point where there's other kinds of work that should be done. And the corporation is like, actually, we can't allow that work to be done because if you do it, you'll discover all of the corners we've cut and then we'll be in trouble. We'll be dragged into court and sued and we could go out of business. So now, in addition to cutting corners, we have to suppress investigation or necessary maintenance to make sure nobody sees our fingerprints there. And there's this way in which the corner cutting spreads. It becomes a rot. And like we see in Sophocles' Oedipus, pretty soon people, when they're exercising the power in these ways, they find themselves hoist on their own petard. And they're trapped in a whole series of decisions of their past self that they made. And they can't figure out how to get out without being more ruthless in the exercise of power to control what other people are allowed to look at or talk about. So,
but we see that in Boeing. the 787 MAX, that we had 3 massive crashes with a loss of life of about, I think, 300 or 400 people. And then the door flies off, in midair.
Right.
Because of lack of quality, right? And that's just exactly what you're talking about. And this is, we're not even talking about the ancients or the medieval. This is the modern world. And things change, but in my opinion, principles and virtues remain the same. It's just how we apply them or not.
Yeah, and the fundamental problem remains the same in all these epochs, which is it's still people trying to get things done in the world, and the kinds of problems that are inherently built into that situation, they don't change just because we have science and technology. It's still a person trying to do things. And so one of the ways that manifests is that issue of 7 plus or minus 2. How many things can a human being keep track of in their conscious mind at any instant? It's very small. It's a small number. And to get beyond that, we need prostheses. We need documents we can write down in spreadsheets and databases, and we need other people to remember other parts of the problem. And if we do that, we can increase our reach, and still be effective. But there's another way to increase our reach without being effective, and that's we can rule things that we don't actually understand, and that we don't have the necessary prostheses to supplement our ignorance with. And when we do that, we rely on do what I say or I'll fire you. Do what I say because I'll give you a bad performance review. Do what I say and I'll pay you. We get these perverse incentives that allow us to kind of overreach. And what you end up with is situations where, and I'll use the Department of Veterans Affairs as an example since I've been working with it for 40 years. You get these examples where instead of a manager ending up in charge of the Department of Veterans Affairs who started at the bottom rung and worked his way up and therefore has decades of experience and knows all the people and what they know and what they don't know and who's good to solve which problem. He knows that because he lived it. That's how it used to work. But the way it works now is it's like when the Roman emperors would appoint their favorites to govern a province they'd never been in before. And the point is looting and pillaging. Go get rich as governor of this province, and of course they'll all hate you and it will be mismanagement, but you'll get to walk away rich, and then the favors that I owe you have been paid back. And that's how DC works now, right? Each of these elections costs so much money, you need so much backing, that after the election, the first thing that has to be done is now you have to arrange how you're going to pay back all the people who got you elected. And we don't mean the people, we're talking about who gave you the big money. And each of those, you need to put either them or their representative in charge of some major government agency. So you get these people flying in and out from the private sector or from somewhere else, and they end up in charge of these massive institutions like the Department of Veterans Affairs, and they know nothing about them. They don't know the people. They don't know the job that's done. They know nothing. And so they surround themselves with people that are designed to make them look good, to help them to have, they give these speeches that have been carefully vetted to sound wise and sound inspiring. But the truth is, no matter how they express it, they don't know what they're doing. And so now the course of their career has to be focused on the one hand, they got to make the money that will pay back for the money that they gave to a previous donation to get somebody elected. And in the course of that, they also have to cover their tracks so that they don't get sued for it. They don't end up in court for it, because it's basically corruption. But it's got to be done carefully, to make sure that the buck does not stop here. The buck stops anywhere but here. I was taught this phrase back in the 90s, SEP, somebody else's problem. All the people who aim to climb to the upper rungs of government learn about SEP. And SEP is, if you want to survive being in charge of things you don't understand, you have to make sure that every problem is somebody else's problem and not your problem. And that way, when a crisis happens, which it will because you don't know what you're doing, because you're not qualified to run this institution, you have around you people that you can throw under the bus and scapegoat and say, well, it's that guy's fault. He did it. It's not me. I'm shocked to discover corruption in this organization. There goes Bob under the bus. And now my career gets to continue and I get to continue collecting money. But meanwhile, I still don't know what I'm doing. and the results of the mismanagement perpetuate. So this is the modern system, and it is exactly analogous to the old provincial governor system under the Romans. Most people in America don't know that's how their government is run. And the ones who get a sense that it's run that way usually are co-opted by an ideology that tells them, okay, that's because it's government and government is corrupt, but the private sector is perfectly virtuous. And of course, what they're missing is all these corrupt people being brought in came from the private sector. That was the whole point of the arrangement, so the private sector could get in charge of an institution that it wanted to make some money off of. So it's not two different antagonistic entities the way the Democrats and Republicans in the US think. It's an integrated system of corruption. I've been watching this for 40 years from the inside and the outside, with the VA. That's the one government organization I know really well. And so, I know from personal experience, this is how it works. And this is going back to what Joe was saying. This is what you expect to see in the late stages of a culture, where people are afraid to change fundamental things because there's too much money and power at stake. If you change those things, somebody powerful is not going to like it. And so when they find out that you want to change that, instead of allowing the change, even if it would make everything better for the civilization, they stop you. They shut you down. They find drugs in the trunk of your car. They discover child pornography on your computer. They'll find something. There's always going to be some way, even if they have to put it there. There's some way to make people, drop out and not have the influence and authority they have anymore. If they're upstarts who are going to, bite the hand that feeds them, rock the boat, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we expect to see in this kind of period of an epoch. It's frustrating. But it's normal. So I know Ari and Stephen are in line, but I promised to go back to Sharon's question. So I want to do that. So I posted up above the first and second half of paragraph 4. And she was asking about the opening sentence of paragraph 4. This concept of supranatural divinity has bound the thinking of Christians to its own absolutist and abstractivist logic, inducing them to suppose that such a religion cannot have arisen out of the natural psychological or historical matrix. So what are we talking about? This is obviously a reaction to paragraph 3 and 2 and 1. There's a flow to this text. And we're talking about the fact that in the ancient worldview, nobody created the world, right? As Heraclitus says, the world always was and is and shall be, an everlasting fire igniting in measures and going out in measures. This is Heraclitus's quote. And the normal ancient Greek perspective was that the world seemed to be eternal. And if it wasn't eternal, it was so much closer to eternity than it was to the span of a human lifetime that you might as well call it eternity. And so their concept of the divinities was nobody made this world. This world has always been here. And so the role of the divinities, even when they're creator gods in the ancient epoch, it isn't to do like the God of Genesis and out of nothing, ex nihilo, we make a universe. It's that, well, there are different parts of the world, there are different parts of nature that have authority over human beings that we have to learn to adapt to. And each of those things that's a big deal, we're going to give a name and a personification to and tell stories about, to try to convey the idea that if you want to be an ancient Greek trader who plies his trade upon the Mediterranean, you would be a fool not to try to learn about the sea. You are not going to get far as an ancient Greek trader if you ignore the sea and say, I prefer the god of wealth, I'm going to focus on him. They're like, no, you're going to go to the bottom of the Mediterranean unless you learn to give Poseidon his due. And it's the same for all of these divinities in the ancient epoch. That's why you need a pantheon. What are the different parts of nature that have authority over people? And you have to watch them all and pay attention, like the mice in the grass when the elephants fight. You have to get out of the way of the elephants. If you ignore the elephants, your life might go fine for a while, but sooner or later, one of them will step on you because you weren't paying any attention. So the ancient divinities are very different from the medieval god. They're very different. You can't ask them for favors necessarily, although there's plenty of myths in which people try to do that. The main thing is it's avuncular wisdom. Your aunt or uncle, tries to give you a little bit of advice and you can follow it or not. They can't make you do it, but if you don't do it, your life might not go well. So supernatural divinity is the first critical part of this sentence that Sharon's calling out. Supra, above nature. This is the medieval revolution. We're the conversion that happens, the arguments of the revolutionary Christians at the beginning of the medieval epoch is, our God is so much more than your gods that your gods shouldn't even be called gods. They're like demons or something. Because how can you call yourself a god if you didn't create everything? You got to be all knowing, all wise, ubiquitous, all good. That's worth worshiping. But the ocean, why should you worship the ocean? That doesn't deserve to be worshipped. So in this revolution come some big changes, and one of them is the ancient divinities were restricted by the same laws of nature that mortals are restricted by. The laws of nature don't change just because they're divinities. They are embodiments of those natural laws, not exceptions to it, if that makes sense. That's the ancient perspective. And you look at it and you say, well, how can that be true? I mean, Zeus is turning into a swan, he's turning into a bull, things are constantly becoming one thing after another. This is all magic. They must be supernatural. But it's like, no, the ancients believe that's how nature works, right? I mean, they didn't think the laws of nature were being violated by a supernatural divinity. It's that they thought in nature things are constantly becoming. They're in a process of change, which is why the ancient word for nature is phusis, which means becoming. That's God knows what somebody's going to turn into tomorrow, right? But whatever it is, it's going to be based on the subtle and powerful laws of nature. So what he's talking about at the beginning of paragraph 4 is this issue that once you change from a natural divinity to a supernatural divinity, as happens when you go from the ancient epoch to the medieval epoch, all kinds of other things have to change in your worldview. Your value system changes, how you interpret the role of human beings, how you interpret the role of nature, all of those things change. Otherwise, they'd be incompatible with each other. They'd be almost inexpressible in each other's terms. So built into this idea of a God who's not bound by the laws of nature is this exaltation of the concept of transcendence, of getting out of the laws of nature. And so the medieval framework starts to see the purpose of human beings as also to follow God's example and transcend nature. The ancients believed that when you die, your body and your soul separate, but your body is you. They didn't believe the soul is the real you. They believe the body is the real you. And what happens to you is you rot. You go back to the earth. And then your soul, you exhale the breath of Suke, your last breath. And that's not the real you. That was just what animated you. And it doesn't go live a harmonious, existence in paradise. It goes to Hades, where it exists as sort of just a vague reflection or shadow of the life that you lived. It's not an afterlife. It's like a ripple in the water left behind after you die. And that's why when Odysseus goes to the underworld to question the wise people of the past, he has to give them blood, to give them some embodiments, to make them come back to life temporarily long enough to have a conversation with. Because without the blood, they're not alive. It's not life after death. It's just a ripple. But when we read it, because we come after the medieval period, we assume that Hades is the afterworld and that these souls are the real person, and that evidently, for whatever reason, they want blood. We just sort of brush that off and say, well, that's some weird Greek thing. So, this concept of which part is real and which part is sort of derived from it is inverted. To the ancients, your body is real and your soul animates you, but is sort of derived. It's important, but it's not the real you. But the medieval framework, since you've got a God who exists outside of nature, we have the concept of a soul that exists outside of nature. And that when you die, the soul is the real you. That's the important part, not the body. And that you have to be all concerned with what the soul does and where it goes. And where it goes is, again, out of nature, into heaven, into paradise. So this pattern of abstracting from concrete reality and abstracting into a framework of absolute laws that are dictated by an absolutely perfect God who knows everything and has all the power. And you have none of it. All that you can do is throw yourself on his mercy and use the gift of his grace to try to have a chance not to go to hell. And that's the framework. This is why he says absolutist and abstractivist. He's like, people start thinking that the important part is the abstract part, not the concrete part. And so you could see why Plato's theory of forms would be appealing. It's not the actual trees that matter. It's the abstract idea of a tree that matters, because abstraction, God's abstracted, our soul is abstracted. Why not a tree? Why not everything around us? The abstract part is the part that matters. And of course, it's always got to be submitted to what are the absolute rules of the orthodoxy, because otherwise you get burned as a heretic, and nobody wants that. So you're always thinking about where do I not get in trouble? What's the part that will line me up with the absolute authority? So this is the framework. And what he's arguing in the sentence that you're asking about is he's saying, once you accept that framework, sort of a contra-natural world in which abstract things are real and concrete things are not, it doesn't set you up well to understand where your own religion actually concretely came from in history, because you don't think concrete things matter. It sets you up to think how I imagine myself in an abstract way as a religion is the important part, just like the abstract part of me is the important part, and God as an abstraction of nature is the important part. So it encourages a focus on what's the orthodoxy, what's the model that we treat as the ultimate reality. So that's kind of what he's talking about there. And for the rest of the paragraph, he basically just plays out the implications of that. What happens with what they're prepared to see and what they're not prepared to see. And he explores the question of where did medieval Christianity come from? And by the way, for Donna's benefit, I do this reminder from time to time. Sometimes Kenneth is very precise with his words, and sometimes he's not. He's using the word Christians here not to talk about modern Christianity or to talk about pre-medieval Christianity. He's talking about medievals, the thinking of the medieval Orthodox brand of Christianity. That's what he's critiquing in this paragraph, because he's talking about the rise of the medieval epoch, and that kind of Christianity is a very different kind of Christianity from modern Christianity. Certainly different from what Jesus taught. And it's different from even what the Roman Catholic Church today says, despite the continuity over time. So I guess that's the caveat I'd add to that. Does that make sense, Sharon? Is that?
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, let's go to the hands then. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hello, everyone. I'm on the lovely walk. I've been listening so pleasantly. Maybe you should I'm going to suggest to keep me in check, put a 5-minute on the clock, because I want to respond to Donna, Steve, Joe, and what we were just talking about within the text, all with marrying a couple of ideas. And it starts with Donna, the answer to my advice to her in her situation when we have this very, what we call toxic environment, or to some degree, what I'm going to describe as a depression, which is the inability to simulate or construct or stay focused on a positive future. And therefore, you're not willing to be able to deal with much novelty, because novelty is either just unwanted or unsafe. And this is very much rooted in what I call the neuroscience of depression, as the brain, according to, if you want to source, Lisa Feldman Barrett in her book, How Emotions Are Made, that we talk about the brain is basically a predictive engine that's always updating its simulations. And so in depression, to much go with what Steve and then Joe was saying, is kind of like a failed solution. As Steve was saying, every idea is a failed idea because it's got falsehoods, it's going to be wrong. And as Joe said, well, then you need the updating idea. But even the self-updating idea is still an idea that's subject to fail. So you need to update the update, the update, the update. And so to some degree, constantly updating doesn't get you anywhere either. So the brain does something in between where it simulates reality and then it updates reality. And if you're stuck in what we'd call negative past simulations, or in this case, the very rigid institution that Rick was talking about with governments, they're fixed. This reflects old age, something that can't adopt to its new system any novelty, because its system is so rigid because it's got so many things in place. And the interesting thing is the more strong, the more power you have, the more robust your ability to predict certain futures that you have. And that gives you a tunnel vision, and that allows you specifically not to be able to move in other ways. It makes you locked in. And if you ever believe that the way you're locked in is a failed model, that it can't predict the future, and that you've run out of energy, so to speak, you start to get depressed. And if you focus on the uncertainty of the future, this is where we get to anxiety, and why anxiety and depression are so similar. Anxiety is being nervous or scared about the uncertainty of the future. So it's, again, negatively looking at the future. And depression is just over simulating the past. Either way, there are different ways of looking at the future is not looking good. And what we say about the way Rick describes this patron-client relationship of the Romans is how it reflects the American system and how the quid pro quo thing goes. You see that we have these institutions effectively that are unable to predict and simulate positive futures. And to some degree, like an organism, what this happens is it invites, in this case, infection, invites something else to start taking away its resources. And perhaps even like a virus, just to make more of itself at the expense of what it was able to infect. And so I think this is what Donna was scared about, is seeing the infectious nature of some of these people. Because I actually don't necessarily think that there's inherently anything wrong or right with the blue or red perspective. Each one of them has certain aspects that seem correct to me. But which parts are toxic and which parts are not is very clear to me. And seeing how it's attacking the system. And in one case, you have people that are very pessimistic, that are very anxious about the future and need to make drastic changes to some sort of mythological, really strong, tyrannical power. And this is the nature of a populist government. And the other side wanted to say, no, we can simulate a better future. We can work together. We can do things in this more of altruistic model, and versus a more hopeless, desperate model. And which one of these two reflected the actual people was the desperation and the fear of uncertainty and the need to do very, what we call, irrational things to give us sort of a false sense of security that we can actually affect our future positively. And in this case, it was just a bacteria, a virus just doing its will, basically like a con man. And a good actor versus a bad actor. And so again, how do you get through this? Is you have to find a way in your own life to simulate something positive that you can contribute to. How can you look for the positive futures? They might be small and they might be far and few between, but there's a lot to be grateful for. And there's a lot of possibility if we focus on it. And the worst thing we can do is like become depressed, is just to become hopeless and stop moving. That's what feels terrible. And to go back to Stephen and Joe about the paradox here is all ideas are false. And then a self-updating idea that learns would be less false. And if it can continually self-update, it can even more so become not false. But at the same time, it's still a false idea because it's still just an idea. All right, I think that's I think I answered a lot of things there. I wanted to say more about noesis versus gnosis and the abstraction in that, but simulating is too much noesis and not enough gnosis.
Thank you. Let me close this app there. There we go. I see they changed their UI and things weren't quite where I expected them to be in the timer. So yeah, I mean, part of what comes out of what Ari said in response to Donna is obviously, Donna, you're asking complex questions, and no quick 5-minute response is going to do justice to the questions. We're going to, it's easier if we explore this over time together than if we try to give a quick, here's the thing, because after all, your circumstances better than we do. So
could I just say that the challenge for me is during a live meeting on the ground, balancing the kind of things you're talking about with the sense reading the room. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I am not really, believe me, I am not all excited and, depressed and all these things that are being told to me. Really, I'm not. I've been in this game for over 50 years, and it continues to be a challenge to me. That's why I come to a meeting like this to get some fresh air and openness. And then I have to go back there because I also show up at the meetings, Really, I am not depressed. I'm far beyond that. Thank you very much. Just clearing the air there, okay?
Thanks, Donna. And thanks, Ari. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I have a major criticism of what I've seen in the way of philosophical groups these days, and that is there's a lot of sentimentalism and a lot of emotionalism. You know, people will talk and engage in rhetoric and repeat themselves continuously because they're driven by emotion. And I'm trying to get over that one. I've understood the master, Hegel, and I've realized my place in the universe as a small, insignificant cog. At last, I've realized everything he said about the individual is absolutely true. Please, universe, drop the bricks on me now. I'm insignificant. I'm an insignificant nobody. Okay, got that out of the way. About 20 years ago, you know, when I was sort of alerted to the growing viciousness between the Republicans and the Democrats, I was born into a world where people were still sort of polite to each other. And now they're starting to behave like gangsters. And I thought, well, does this have a historical parallel where you look at the death of the Roman Republic? Now, the thing is, Polybius decided that Rome had the goods. Rome had created the system that was going to last forever. But he was looking at the destruction of the Republic right in his face and he didn't even notice it. Or he didn't care to notice it because noticing it might have been a bad idea when you're surrounded by Romans. I don't know which is true. But the great case was the case of Tiberius Gracchus. He was the first of Rome's wannabe Caesars. And he got the chop. Then there was another Caesar. He got the chop. Eventually he got Caesars with the actual name Caesar. He was almost made it, but he missed by just this much. And then his nephew, Augustus, he romped home with the goods. He'd figured out the game. He became the first of the permanent Caesars. Now, what I was unaware of Spengler, but this sort of thinking pattern of observing history, Spengler's very good at it. And he'd seen this 100 years ago. He was pointing out the thing about the Gracchus 100 years ago, that this is the thing, the Rome, which was getting a Caesar, which was going to get a king after they'd reviled kings for centuries, was a Rome that was losing its traditional religiosity or morals to power. Now he's saying that the Enlightenment isn't being threatened by Godzilla. The Enlightenment killed itself before Godzilla even showed up. You know, the modern enlightened person thinks, look, I won't mention the evil name, but Godzilla's there on the horizon, the new Caesar. The only reason he showed up is we dropped the traditional Christian value rhetoric. He could never have come into being or made it to where he was without our loss of the traditional religion. This is something Spengler points out, that the traditional religion was killed by the rationalist Enlightenment, and that makes it possible for the tyrant to appear. Now, he said that the new Caesars, and this was a great shock to me, it's right there in the Wikipedia, will come with an attempt to revive the old religiosity. The new Caesar will walk hand in hand with that. This is what Simon Gracchus tried to do. He tried to return the Republic back to its more primitive virtues. And in fact, all the Caesars did, even Augustus was trying to turn the clock back on morals to that more idealistic Republican phase. So that's it. Spengler's point, big point. The Enlightenment killed itself. Don't blame the great monster on the horizon. You did it to yourselves. If you want to look for who caused the problem, look to yourselves first. And the thing is, the monster is coming in with a restyled religiosity, a claim that they want to return to the former morals. And I didn't take 2025 seriously before, but just looking at Spengler, now I do take it seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's this aspect to this in which, part of the critique that the ancients have of human epistemology is that we have a warped interpretation of our own epoch. We don't know which epoch we're living in. We have some dates, and we have a name, and we have our parochial experiences that we had within that, and we say, well, this must be the summation of what this epoch actually is. But we're always missing an enormous amount of what's defining about that epoch. And then it shocks the hell out of us when events arise that are, on the one hand, completely out of sync with what we thought we were living through, but are completely in sync with the underlying logic of the epoch that we weren't aware of. And so you see that with, the way that, the rise of white nationalism in the United States was described by countless liberals as coming from nowhere. It's like, where did this come from? Who made normal people want to behave like this? And of course, the people who are saying that didn't live in Missouri, where I have a friend who lives in Missouri. He's lived there his whole life. And he says, through his entire life, you go to a major grocery store or department store, and in the aisles, the word nigger coming out of white mouths is happening every day, all the time. The level of racism has always been there, but we were living in a little bubble where we could tell ourselves that we were in a Martin Luther King had marched. We're now in a post-racist society, and everybody's more or less enlightened together. And then that fantasy, when it gets ruptured with the actual people who actually exist, who are actually racist, marching in the street and saying, hello, I'm a racist. And we go, wow, what the hell happened? Half of our frustration, whether we like it or not, is not about the fact that racist people are marching openly. It's about the fact that our fantasy has been ruptured. Our fantasy was that we were in a different epoch than the one we're actually in. And that fantasy meant a lot to us. It helped us to feel grounded in the world and connected to other human beings. And if that's not true, if actually all along we've had people thinking about lynchings and things like that, who would have done it if they thought they could get away with it, but they didn't think they could, but now they're emboldened, so they think they could talk about it, but they were always there. That means our entire life has been a different life than the life we thought it was. And so what the Greeks say is, most people don't want to go through those kinds of disruptions of their worldview. They would rather just push the evidence away that disproves their fantasy and say, that must be an aberration. Okay, that was just that one time. That was just that one guy. Even if you have to say it 10 million times, it's suggesting there might be 10 million guys, you still, the power of the mind to suppress and repress evidence that it doesn't want to see is shocking. It is amazing how powerful that is. It's a reflex so fast that we wield that faculty of our mind without ever realizing we did it. We don't know that we're pushing these things into the background in order to create the picture of the world that we want. But Heraclitus talks about this, Diogenes talks about this, Aristotle talks about this. He says this is just, if you study human beings long enough, you will see it happening all the time. And if you think about it, the metaphor that I like to use on this is the Mercator projection. And the Mercator projection is an attempt to take the surface of a sphere and flatten it to a rectangle. And of course, the problem is the surface of a sphere is not a rectangle. So the only way you can make it fit a flat rectangle is to do enormous amounts of distortion to the picture to warp it into shape. This is where we get the Greek myth of Procrustes, the Procrustean bed, the perfect miraculous bed that can fit any guest. But of course, it's not a miracle. The way he fits them is by cutting parts off of them or stretching them like on a rack until they perfectly fit the bed. There's this way in which the human mind has these powers of distortion, that to make new information compatible with our existing framework for interpretation. And that might be the thing that the human mind is better at than anything else. It's our superpower, fitting the pattern, making it fit. That power that the man with a hammer has to make every problem look like a nail. He thinks the power is, look at me, I can drive nails. It's like, no. The superpower was before that. You looked at a tree and saw a nail. You looked at two people arguing and saw a nail. You saw a political economic crisis and you saw a nail. It's like, that's the power to translate things into the framework that makes us comfortable. And on the one hand, we get the short-term comfort out of that, which can be very important when we're living a frustrating life. But the downside is it sets us up for these catastrophic shocks when our bubble is ruptured by reality being radically different than we thought it was. So, I know a lot of people wish that we were living in a Star Trek world where everybody's, honoring diversity and exploring the world together and blah, blah, blah. But, and I grew up with Star Trek. I mean, I was watching Star Trek episodes first run when I was little, very little. It's been with me my whole life. But it's taken me a long time to figure out that is not the world we're living in. Maybe someday it will be, but it sure isn't now. We're living in a world that is just a little while after the Civil War. We're living in a world that is even less time after Jim Crow. We're living in a world in which, during my lifetime, Indigenous women would go to the hospital for a medical procedure, and without their knowledge, they'd be sterilized, and they'd come home and they couldn't have babies. That was the 70s, the 1970s. The United States government and our hospitals were still sterilizing Indigenous women without their permission. That's genocide, right? My lifetime, actual practicing genocide. And most of us go through our lives without ever thinking about that. And so it isn't happening for us. And so that's not the world we're living in, as far as we know. And thus it's really shocking and upsetting when we discover that is the world that we're living in. This is the actual circumstances. So, one of the things that we've talked about, Joe, I think about 2 years ago, asked me on one of these calls. He said, well, what is Kenneth Smith recommending? I mean, it's all well and good to look at the problem and say, look at these problems, but where do we go from here? What's his philosophy say? And of course, the thing about Kenneth Smith that's difficult is Kenneth Smith is saying he doesn't know where we go from here. He's not saying there's nowhere to go, but he's saying, as a fish swimming in the water, I'm the least qualified to tell you what to do about the water. I take it for granted just like you do. But here, says Kenneth Smith, is what I do know. Until we understand that we're fish swimming in water, we don't have a chance of getting out of the water. Until Daedalus knows he's in the labyrinth, he can't get out. As long as he thinks the problem is I stub my toe, it's some little momentary thing, he's always going to be underestimating the scale of the problem, and his strategies are always going to be the wrong strategies. But once Daedalus realizes he's stuck in a labyrinth, that's what opens up the possibility of the creativity that makes him invent wings to fly out. He can't do it until he knows he's in the labyrinth. So that's what existentialist philosophy in a nutshell is all about. Can we work out how to see our circumstances not in the way we've been propagandized or ideologized to see them, where we're living in a fantasy world version of reality, but can we use the tools at our disposal, like access to the ancient worldview or the medieval worldview or indigenous worldviews or other worldviews, to look back on our circumstances and figure out what have we been missing that's really important about this situation, so that we can then have the possibility of new creative solutions. That's ultimately what all of this is about. I'm going to call on Sharon first. I can see she's...
Because I think what you said is so profound. And my perspective of this, of what you said, is amplified by the fact that I come from a different culture. And I've been through many, many different cultures. And I think the last election, with Donald Trump, I don't think he changed us. I think he revealed us. Exactly what you're talking about in Missouri. And the other thing, slavery is still, in America, is still an unresolved issue. We've had a civil war, but it's still there. We haven't had what I would call a root cause analysis about it, and I've seen it. The British people did a little bit of that, right? The South Africans did a little bit of that, but it makes for the perception of a society, changing the perception of a society on its road to being healthy. You never ever get there, but when you stay ill all the time, you can only deteriorate. And I think that's where we are. Thank you. Thank you, Ari.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Sharon. And I think that's right on. You see these criticisms of the internet, and people say the internet makes people rude. There's lots of analysis about, is it the narrow bandwidth of having words but no voice sound and no facial expression or body language that makes us be rude and mean to each other? There's analysis of why the spread of so much misinformation. How come there's so many memes that have quotes attributed to people? And then if you actually look into it, that guy never said that. And furthermore, he totally wouldn't say that. That's out of character for that person. It's implausible. Not only is it false, it's implausible. And yet it spreads like wildfire all over the internet. And so people say there must be a problem with the internet. But I like to think it's the opposite. We've always had this problem. Gossip, misinformation has been our normal water that we swim in. And what happens on the internet is we pass along our misinformation, but now for the first time, there's a permanent record of it. And so we can't afterwards tell ourselves we didn't do that. We didn't say that. We didn't make that mistake. We didn't spread that misinformation. Now it's just obvious in front of everybody. There's like the signatures of our mistakes are out there in the open. And I think it's progress because it gives us the ability to see ourselves more accurately. And with that more accurate perception, we can start to adopt new behavioral strategies. Like, I don't share quotes on the internet unless I have looked them up. I go to Quote Investigator, for example, or Wiki Quotes, and I say, did he really say this? And if he really said it, then I want to attribute what was the work? What was the chapter and page? What year was it published? I want to open the book and look and see the line of text in the book. And if I can do that, then I want to share the quote, and I want to share it with proper attribution. But if I make a blunder and I don't do that and I share it and it turns out he didn't say that, then I want to leave the post up, but I want to add a thing that says this was wrong. I shared this in error. Here's how I know. Here's how you could find out for yourself that I blew it. We can adopt a new standard for how we deal with information designed to solve the problems that are being exposed by the internet without blaming the internet, with taking responsibility ourselves for the misinformation that we pass around. So I agree with Sharon about this issue. People blame Trump for all kinds of stuff, and there's some things he's responsible for, no question. But he was always there, and the people who voted for him, Trump didn't tie their hands, didn't twist their arms behind their backs and force them to vote for him. That we've always had a lot of people who think that way, the ways that Trump thinks, and maybe they just didn't have the courage to say it out loud, but it didn't stop them from thinking it or voting on it or acting on it whenever they felt like it. This is the country that we're living in. The father of a friend of mine died recently, and I will protect the name to protect the innocent. And even while he was dying, he wanted Fox News on. He wanted to constantly be getting that stream of anger and resentment and rage. He's a sweet guy. He took care of people. He was really kind. He was considerate. He had many fine qualities, but he couldn't stop listening to that stuff. And there's people like that all over America, and they need it. And we have to know that that's happening if we're going to, deal intelligently with each other. If we pretend that that's not happening, if we pretend that that's not the way that our country is, then we're just going to be surprised over and over, and disappointed. We shouldn't be. This is where we are. There's a thing in traditional Okinawan martial arts that says there's no shame to being a white belt. Everybody starts as a white belt. Where the hell else are you supposed to start? And there's no pride associated with being a black belt. That just means you've learned more and you've been doing it longer. But the more high your belt ranking, the greater your responsibility towards the people who don't have that rank, to share the information, to help teach them. and that you don't teach them at the level you're at, you teach them at the level they're at. You say, I remember when I was a white belt and I knew 2 katas, but not the third one. I remember where that's at. Let me help you to get from kata 2 to kata 3. Let me help you through here's the things that I saw that opened my eyes when I was doing that journey. And it can be done in a non-dismissive, a non-damnation medieval kind of way. But only if we understand that we're in this together, and this isn't about good fights evil and defeats it and then we win and yay at the end of the story. None of it's like that. It's never going to be like that. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, yeah. I think I first want to say I'm going to try and bring up something within the text. Specifically, we talked about the focus is, maybe we didn't focus it quite explicitly, but it was the aspect of the new supernatural God being based in logos and abstraction. I want to focus on that specifically. Before I do that, I want to make some sort of general apology to Donna. I didn't mean to call you depressing or depressed. I meant to say that maybe a lot of our situation that we all share, but specifically you share, is depressing and makes it hard to simulate a positive future. And that in general, that I think what I would attribute some mythological, not evidence-based stuff about what Kenneth is doing here is that he's also trying to keep us hopeful about, like, hey, I don't have any answers, but I got a really useful step. I got a really useful tool, which is see yourself as fish in water. Because you can't see the water, you're hopeless, right? So that is very useful. And I want to bring up an idea that might challenge a lot of this. It's not really mine alone. I looked up one specific modern philosopher who really says this about our society. It's called Michael Sandel. But there's another one too that I can't remember his name. But they specifically say that although we are looking at a decline of, like, Spigen was saying, we're near the death and end of our society based on these normal things. There's some other things that are going on that seem to really say we might not be. Specifically, I think it was Joe talking about when we get we need growth, and a society needs growth that requires resources. Well, in the last 100 years, it's the humanity's ability to technologically acquire new resources like nuclear power or solar power or information processing through the internet. It's not about resources right now. We've been able to do a bunch of amazing things where our resources vastly outweigh typical declines, access to resources. So the thing that's also similar is our lust or our appetite for resources is still vastly increasing. So that maybe even if we can go to renewables, we'll never get there because we still are dependent on oil because our consumption levels are so high. But there's another thing. There's another, I forget the specific really famous philosophers that mentioned this sort of epoch sort of nature. One is Will Durant. Another one I can't remember specifically, but they talk about when you notice the signals for death of an empire, you have it when the fall of the mythology, the fall of the religiosity. They also couple that with the discovery of new information technology. So at the beginning, you have writing showing up, and then you have alphabet showing up, and then you have scrolls showing up, and then you have books showing up. And I think one of the major technological changes that Kenneth may be actively or more, he might not even know it, unconsciously be writing it, is to go from a god where a type of god which is nature and bounded in nature and limited to nature, to a type of god that is purely abstracted and purely reasoned, and is a huge advance in technology. Actually, it's a huge advance in information processing and information technology. It's another way of outsourcing information beyond what we already had. And this transformation, being able to use books to now do this, to make codexes which can refer to each other and are much more robust in terms of their bureaucraticness. Now you can imagine a future with new technology that you need because the old world has failed and you are, let's say, depressed about it and the ship is sinking. Well, in this case, it's not necessarily fixing the sinking ship that works, as if we throw the right guy off, the gods will be appeased. So sometimes it's just a change of reference gives us the novelty
which allows us to simulate a better future, which to some degree is where I base a lot of populism is we outsource individual responsibility or individual ability to create certainty towards some very powerful demagogue who's just going to make me feel better. And so there's a lot of these guys like Will Durant who notice the correlation between populism and tyrannical form of government and populism based in people no longer having personal or community responsibilities. They outsource it to some magical thinking that there's one guy, even though we're in a giant system of infinite complexity, one guy is going to fix or make or break everything. It's a very big fiction. And yes, and the only thing that makes a tyrant so truly powerful is when everybody starts to believe the magical thinking, right? That its own sort of mythology that becomes uniting, at least temporarily. But the thing that I would say here that's really challenging to why we might not actually be failing and why this is specific. Michael Sandel says the American empire might be greater than ever before is if you measure it in terms of information and information control. If you look at the systems of control of information around the world, they're pretty much like Apple and Google. Maybe there's some others, but the vast majority of these types of, and Facebook, if you want to see where the information is flowing through these networks, then these are the real hubs of humanity in terms of civilization and the stock market as well. So long as these things are in America, it seems like the American government is dying and the American institutions are definitely failing. But when you look at the robustness of control of information around the world, it seems like America has an amazing empire. And specifically, so long as they can find a way to use technological growth to get the resources that they need. And I think the other big caveat is that we didn't screw up our environment so badly that our whole city falls apart. Like if they could keep going with these things, it seems strangely optimistic because the level of growth and the level of information technology, and I think there's something else that might be the linchpin here is yes, growth, yes, resources, but each one of these epics that changed is attached to technological changes like the scroll and the book, and then the Gutenberg printing press is the modern enlightenment. Now you have the internet. The internet says whoever can control the internet can control the information of the whole world and could be in control of the whole world. And this to me seems like the mythology of why we're almost recreating God in terms of called general AI, where if you're the first country to create general AI, you could control the internet and you could control all the information of the whole world. And you, to some degree, are worshiping a new God that's going to be able to do everything for you. And so there's this, I mean, at least I understand it, the American government and the Chinese government and all the other big players are trying to create general AI as fast as they can without the worry that it's going to destroy us, because there's a good chance that it's going to be like, oh, these carbon life forms, they're not as efficient as silicon life forms. We're just going to get rid of them all. And so, but again, where we're at, it's very interesting to see that there's some big new things that have never happened before. Our environment becoming destabilized, AI to some degree perhaps on the horizon, more and more technology giving us access to more and more resources. This seems the type of growth that is the opposite of the death of a civilization. So, but I will say back to the text, what's so important here is I think that their abstraction and logos of God was a technological advantage that allowed them to have the mimetic sort of meme with the words attached to it that everybody could then learn and was highly infectious. It was a type of information that was able to be universal, and then definitely just in terms of if ideas are alive, it just killed off all the other weaker forms of gods that had existed. To this day, I mean, it's got almost everybody. And if it doesn't have you, you're at least aware of it as sitting there. I think every Hindu is at least aware of the Christian God to some degree, unless you're really in a not a more exposed territory. I mean, I can imagine you're in a village where you don't have access, but anybody who lives in the world at least knows of the Christian God, which is a huge dominance of itself, even if you don't believe in it. I mean, an atheist, I would say an atheist just believes in the God to some degree just because you fight against its power over your mind. You say, no, this isn't real, this is fake, but it's still there and it still plays on you like, hey, there's a Christian God, there's a Jewish God, there's an Islamic God, he exists, and a lot of people think he's the God of the universe. So it's I think that's a good place to stop. But I really like the focus on the text, that what did the abstraction, because this is Nietzsche talks about how logos and the getting rid of the Dionysian was the staying away from the the affirmation of life and turning everybody into a herd mentality. But I think it's exactly that. It's an opiate that somehow infected everyone who's really powerful. This new technology of God in the idea of the mind being purely abstract and supernatural. That's the key. It doesn't have to be based in nature. Therefore, you can completely imagine it. And because you can imagine it, it's more powerful than anything. And this is ironically exactly Thomas Aquinas' argument for proof of God, is he says that any real God is better than any God you can imagine. And I think it's exactly the opposite. The more you can imagine the God, that's way more powerful than a real God, because then a God had to create that to be able to imagine that. So it's a very interesting idea of reversing this proof of God, that no, it's actually the abstraction of God that's the power of God.
Thank you, Ari. And you know, this goes to the heart of one of Kenneth Smith's arguments, which is that the rise, you know, we've talked about the two faculties of the mind, the gnosic and the noetic. And of course, there's more faculties, but these two ones that the Greeks were concerned with, where the gnosic is the one that allows us to be immersed in the stream of experience, to make ourselves to a greater whole with reality by plugging ourselves into it fully. And this is what the infant experiences. You know, all of the pains, all of the pleasures, everything is turned up to 11. But noesis is this abstractivizing, negating, systematizing, logic-oriented approach to thinking, which allows us to plan for the future and to try to control the world and ourselves. And, you know, the argument that Kenneth makes here is that in the ancient epoch, especially during the ancient Greek epoch, we see the shift from a culture that reveres gnosis towards a culture that reveres noesis and that demonizes gnosis. This is what Nietzsche talks about when he talks about the Dionysian and the Apollonian. He's talking about gnosis versus noesis. So once noesis was put on a pedestal as the correct faculty of the mind, logic, math, this is the right way to think, and gnosis was demonized as the wrong way to think, it set us up to be open to the kind of religion that Ari's talking about. If a religion to come along and say, I'm going to offer you a God that completely appeals to your noesis. You can run logic to your heart's content. Everything about him is logical and coherent and consistent and abstract. You know, feel free to pour all of your noetic energies into writing about this God and imagining, you know, what are his characteristics and how must the world work in order to be, you know, his creation and so on. It's just an explosion of noetic creativity that becomes possible. And that's in fact what we see. If we go to, I'm going to see if I can just pull up the website. It's called earlychristianwritings.com. And it's a website that attempts to catalog every early Christian work that we know about, whether we have it or not, whether it's been lost or not. If somebody talked about it and said, you know, if one of the early church fathers said there was this gospel of so-and-so and here's what was in it, then it's on this site. It'll say, you know, here's what we know about it. This guy said the following things. And what you see when you look at these dates and you look at the works, how many gospels, how many acts, how many, you know, apocalypses, how many letters. It's just an explosion of creativity. Everybody's writing gospels and letters and acts and apocalypses like crazy about the new God. And you know, it's also interesting if you read some of the ones that were not included in the canon, but that some of which were more popular than the works that were included in the canon. A larger percentage of pre-medieval Christians might have believed some of these works than believed the ones that ended up in the canon. There's just it encouraged everybody to sort of engage in this giant dialogue. It's sort of the equivalent, and I don't mean to equate, but it's got a relationship to the ferment that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s around Star Trek fan fiction. Anybody in the fan community knows there was an explosion of conferences. People would get together and talk about what did Spock mean in this episode, and what do you think about McCoy versus so-and-so. I mean, there was this ability to really play with and explore these ideas that caused a community to ferment around it and to grow and to generate masses of fanfic magazines and you know, I was looking at the number of Star Trek novelizations and extended universe Star Trek novels, and it's vast. There's so many of them. It's enormous. And of course, we've seen all the movies and all the TV series and so forth. this is what happens when you sort of have a shared set of ideas that you're invited to play with, you're invited to think about, and to talk to the other people who are thinking about them and playing with them. You get these, it becomes a conceptual factory, if you will, where ideas just pour forth in a great fountain. And the new concept of a supernatural divinity, whether or not it's a technological advancement, I can agree with Ari that it caused enormous creative ferment. And this website is just the evidence of it. And this is all only the evidence we have. God knows how many more scrolls and books were written that have been lost, and we don't even have a reference to them. But I mean, it was just an explosion of creativity that happened around this period. So the other thing is, I think another way to think about it is, you don't have to adopt the idea that history is a meritocracy to understand the idea that things change and develop. So, medieval Christianity might not have arisen because it was better than the old system. It could have other reasons for developing. And one could be that it solved certain problems. One of the problems is that people were really burned out on the promise of the ancient epoch. I mean, Rome drove the promise into the ground with its corruption until nobody could believe in the Pax Romana. I mean, not literally nobody, but let's say a very small minority could believe in the Pax Romana by the time Rome fell. And that, that's part of why Rome fell. Barbarians had invaded before. Rome had been sacked countless times BCE. Athens had been sacked countless times BCE, but they always rebuilt. But on the final fall of Rome, the barbarians come, it gets sacked, and what does everybody say? It's not worth it. All the taxes, all the corruption, all the frustration, it's just been more trouble than it's worth. So this time we won't rebuild. And thus we put a line on the timeline and say this is the end of the ancient epoch. But really the reason that it's a change is because people were burned out and frustrated. The new God gave us something new to think about. There's a whole, what is the idea of heaven and hell mean? What is the idea that the soul is the real you and the body is not you? To people who used to think the body is the real you and the soul is just your breath, this was a radical set of ideas. They had to be explored. They had to be, what are the implications? And Aquinas and Augustine and all of the other writers effectively are just continuing this process of trying to figure out, where does this all lead? What are the possibilities inherent in this new set of ideas? You see this with a new programming language. I mean, Donald and I, we program, and one of the things that you see is from time to time a new language comes along, like Java did in the late 80s, early 90s, or like JavaScript did in the 80s. And it causes an explosion because it's a new way to think about problems. It's a new way to think about solutions. And everybody wants to know, is this going to address the frustrations I have with the languages that I've been using so far? Is it going to give me a new ability to express the things that we're trying to accomplish? You don't know until you explore it. So I can agree with Ari that the new conception of God and nature and man inherent in the medieval framework, it was very exciting for people who'd been very burned out and pessimistic, I think is a way to put it. And I think that's a more interesting way than the way Gilbert Murray puts it in Five Stages of Greek Religion, where he calls it the loss of nerve. Gilbert Murray, the classicist, obviously loved the ancient civilization. He was a Hellenophile, and for him, the loss of the giving up on the old polytheistic philosophical approach was frustrating, and so he calls the turn away from the ancient worldview. That chapter is called the loss of nerve. But I think another way to put it is, finally something new and interesting to think about, something hopeful. Here's a new set of ideas that I'm not, I think that's part of what it was about, is the excitement of, and it not just that it was novel, but that it was novel at a deep foundational level. It required rethinking everything, and that finally called for people to engage their creativity again in a way that 500 years of Roman Empire had not encouraged them to do. So Anyway, it's a possibility. So it's the way we have to read this stuff as we're going through and looking at this change into the medieval epoch. Is it's not just about the new theology and philosophy and worldview beating the old one. It's also about the old one being very tired and frustrated, right? People, as Robert McKee says in his book Story, to genuinely be a protagonist in a story, the character has to be ripe for change, to the point where you're like, how come they haven't changed already? They're at the tipping point. It just takes a nudge to make things begin to change. And 500 years of exploitation by corrupt governors sets people up to be ready for things need to change. It needs to be different. Something new needs to come along. How about the idea that all men are brothers? What if we don't exist to screw each other over for for who can win? What if we're all children of God together and we have to treat each other well? And this is a new and interesting set of ideas. You can see why it would excite people. All right, questions. Stephen, then Sharon, then Joe. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, referring to the earlier political discussion, the one thing, well, I guess I've learned is misreading the situation, because we have our preferred view of what reality should be. And I'd bring up Hannah Arendt. I was reading a comic called The Free Escapes of Hannah Arendt. And her great escape was, well, this was, 1933, and her fellow Jewish friends are saying, well, I think it's time to make tracks. And she's saying, what's wrong with you guys? This is Germany. This is the land of Goethe. This is the land of Schiller. What are you talking about? The Germans will never behave in an uncivilized fashion. While at the very moment, the uncivilized people are running circles around the cities because she didn't want to take away her ideal view of reality. They made tracks. She stuck around. No, the Germans are never going to do anything funny. And she was imprisoned, and it was sheer luck she ran into a sympathetic Nazi who helped her get out of prison. And when she got out of prison, she didn't need to be told again. She made tracks. But this is the thing, just because I have an ideal of what the world should be, doesn't mean the world's going to be like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to order that book, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt. That's my kind of book, and I can't believe I haven't read it yet. I'm really looking forward to it. She's a fascinating character for a lot of reasons. And of course, she's relevant to this discussion. For Donna and Ari's benefit, if I haven't mentioned it before, Hannah Arendt is on the list of existentialist philosophers that Kenneth Smith says he's really influenced by and finds very interesting. So learning more about her work will directly play into this. These concepts of the different character types in ancient Greek society corresponding to the different realms of the economy, corresponding to different voting rights. This is the core to the political economy of the ancient Greek world, and Hannah Arendt describes it in detail in The Human Condition. So there's a lot of Hannah Arendt all throughout this book, even though she herself might disagree with many things that are actually written in this. There's others where she'd nod and say, yeah, that's the stuff. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, no, you're going to take us back to the text, aren't you?
Yes. But before I get there, here's the thing that fascinates me, that I find very interesting. And I think I see this as the difference between arts and science, dealing with reality. I deal with reality as it is, not through any lenses. And I guess that's because of the occupation I've led my whole life. You gotta be real. You gotta see it for what it is. You cannot dress it up. If not, you're in a lot of problems very quickly. And that I extrapolate to my real life too, because if you can't deal with the reality, then you can't problem solve. But anyway, may I go back to the text? Okay. In spite of its repudiation of its own natural historical lineage, this is the paragraph you started with. Christianity in its origins was very much a symptom of ancient culture. So you could explain that. I think it's a growth, and I think cultures just don't, it's a transition process. And I think you made that very clear when we first started. Its very concept of spirit was a retort or counterforce to the fatalism of ancient naturalism, without whose contrasting principles, the defining natural dialectic of active/passive, the meaning of spirit cannot be grasped. As today, so many uncomprehensive true believers, evidenced by the ingenious way they have compounded Christianity with ethnocentrism, class interest, racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and xenophobia. That last sentence is very, very powerful. And I want to go back to the Bible, where Jesus in his teaching warned us. He says, beware of the yeast in the Pharisees' bread, because that's where the false teachings lie. And I think this is where we are today, because Christianity, as we practice it today, is a long way from what it actually is, at least in America. And that's my experience with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, there's several critical things here. And obviously, the very timely one, and as a result of the election, is the second half, the parenthetical at the second half of the sentence. But I'm going to take us back to the first half. That first sentence, there's something very interesting in. This idea that medieval Christianity arose in a way that turned its back on its own historical origins and focused on an abstractivized, source, saying that we exist because of God, we exist because of Jesus, and not saying we exist because of all these historical precedents before that got blended together under these conditions. So he says he's starting out trying to, saying that granted, they were looking away from those things, but despite that, medieval Christianity and the way it was phrased, he calls it a symptom of ancient culture. And there's two ways in which that plays out. And one of them is that when in the letters and gospels and other early writings, Christians are making their arguments in favor of their religion, those arguments are not directed to us as moderns. We didn't exist. Our worldview didn't exist. Our concept of God, man, and nature didn't exist. Our hypernoetic way, our hypernoetic value system didn't exist. It also, and this is the part that can be harder to grasp, it also was not addressed to medievals, right? Because the medieval world didn't exist yet. When Christianity begins arising, the medieval world is still another 500 years off. So the milieu, the intellectual life that the early Christian arguments are centered in and addressed toward are the ancient arguments. They're arguing with Stoicism, they're arguing with Epicureanism, they're arguing with Platonism, they're arguing with Aristotelianism, all of these things. And as a result, because that's the context for the debate, it means that the definitions of soul and God and man and all of these core concepts that they're using to argue with, despite the fact that they're doing a transvaluation of values, like we said last week, that transvaluation of values wouldn't be comprehensible if it weren't for the fact that the starting definitions of all the terms are the ancient definitions, right? That's who they have to persuade. That's who they're talking to. It's why these things were written in Greek, because they're addressing a learned Greek audience, and they're using the learned Greek definitions of psyche, or ethos, or all those other, value loaded terms. And as a result, when the early Christian argument is in its very best, most persuasive light, is when it is as a response within the ancient world to the problems of the ancient worldview. That's Christianity firing on all cylinders, getting an A+ and a gold star. That's when it is the most impressive, is as a response to the ancient world. It was never designed to be a response to corruption in the modern US government, right? These are different conditions and different circumstances, and we mean different things by all of the words. Our value system is completely different. So there is this, what he's talking about in the second sentence is the weird way that in the modern world, when people are trying to be true to Christianity, what they're being true to is a different religion than early Christianity was, because we can't even conceive of the context in which the original religion grew up. We don't think like ancients, let alone like revolutionaries who are pushing back against the ancients. That entire framework, the closest we can come is a caricature, if we try at all. And most people don't try at all, and they just try to imagine that the ancient world was pretty much the same as the modern one, but just less efficient, less pragmatic, more savage, more backwards. And we can't fully understand even the idea that there was an ancient worldview that's just as valid as our worldview, let alone be able to characterize what was it and what did they think of things. And so what was the thrust of these Christian arguments? What were they saying about those? We can, having spent 2 years going through chapter 4 on these calls, we can actually take a little stab at parts of this. And we can see how early Christianity arises as a response to the ancient world, saying, you promised that if we did governments and economies driven by nature, both the nature around us and human nature, character, if we tried to structure things so that the best people rose to the top, a meritocracy, and we let those people govern, you said that we would have a better world. But what we see is corruption everywhere in Rome. It's rotten. So you didn't deliver on your promise. And that's why you need this new religion, because this new religion recognizes your flaws and offers you a way out of it. Right? It's the wing salesman talking to Daedalus, saying, I know that you're trapped and frustrated, but I have a solution. Have you considered the third dimension? Maybe instead of turning left or turning right or going straight, you should go up. Get out of the labyrinth. This is your way out. This is how you're going to get out of this mess that you're in. This is an argument that had a specific audience. One of the things that writers always, teachers of writing always recommend over and over is, first of all, write what you know. But second of all, write to your audience. Know your audience. Know who they are. Know what they care about, what they're frustrated about, what they love, what they're excited about, and you write to them. And the result is you can't create a work for the ages. Nobody can do that, because different ages see the world differently, and they communicate differently. They think differently. But you can create a meaningful work for your age that directly addresses the problems of your audience, if you know who they are. So our problem is we're reading this work that was written for a specific audience, but we don't know who the audience is or how they see the world. And we just assume the audience is us, which is the one thing we can be absolutely certain it wasn't. It was not aimed at us. So this is part of what he's talking about here, is there is a very specific context for the medieval world. And what he's alluding to here, it's not saying that, of course, the religion can't grow. It's not saying the religion can't change. It's not saying that a modern version of the religion couldn't directly address us. But it's saying the works that were written in the 1st and 2nd centuries were not written for us. They were written for, the successors of Plato and Aristotle and Diogenes and so forth. They were, Marcus Aurelius. They were written to these people. I see you want to add something, Sharon. Go ahead.
I have a quick question. In the ancient culture, Plato's endorsement of the good, wasn't that one of the foundations? Well, couldn't that be seen as one of the foundations of Christianity?
Could which thing be seen as the foundation?
Plato's endorsement of the good. Or am I understanding that correctly?
Expand on that a little bit.
Well, Plato endorsed the good in your treatment of other human beings, right? Yes. Wasn't that one of the foundations from the ancient culture? Foundations of Christianity, which came from the ancient culture? Yes? No?
Yes.
Could it be
Yes.
seen as that? I'm asking.
Yes. The good and the beautiful.
Yes.
Kalakagatha, right? This is Aristotle uses this phrase too. It's not just Plato and it's not just Aristotle, but it's a Greek attempt to summarize how obliquely we have to figure out what the right thing is to do. And part of it they postulate is the good, not just the immediate practical good for me, but also the long-term sustainable good, the best good for everyone. And then on top of that, they marry it to this agathos, kalos concept, which is that when you have found the hidden harmony, the path that allows you to harmonize correctly with nature, the result is beautiful. It may be a subtle beauty, but it'll be there for you to find if you can learn to appreciate the subtle beauties of harmonizing with the bigger picture. And so that concept, kalos kai agathos, or kalkagathos, they merge it together into one word sometimes. For sure, that's the basal foundation that that Paul and the other writers are addressing. I think you're right.
Could you put that in the chat, that Greek word in the chat?
Yes. Kalos kai agathos. That's the three words. And I always forget what the merged form is, but it's kalkagathos or something. They do a merged version of it. But kalos is like the I always remember it because of the funny word Callipygian. You got to say, wow, a language that has a word that means they have a beautiful butt. I mean, there's a value system at work when you've got a word that's just built right into your language. That means a fine, shapely derriere, Callipygian. So pygnos for the derriere, and kalos meaning beautiful, Callipygian. So kalos kai and agathos, like the name Agatha. That's good, the good, the beautiful and the good. And I always think, whenever I see this, I think Heraclitus is hidden harmony, and I think the Navajo beauty way, to walk in beauty. This is that same idea that when you find the right path, the sustainable way of life, it's beautiful. That to be in that state, and that when you do wrong, your goal should be to find a way to get back into that state of harmony, and thus all of the Navajo rituals that they have, that they go through to try to restore that sense of the kalos kai agathos. It's oh, thank you, Donald. Yeah, there's a little abbreviation. They abbreviate the end, kalos kagathos. So yeah, I mean, that's that. It means that when modern translators translate these Greek texts, we completely miss a lot of this stuff, and we translate it into a modern vernacular that's sort of evacuated of this extra freight that would have been meaningful in the original to the Greek audience to which it was directed. And in fact, not only would it have been meaningful, that part that's left out might have been the whole thrust of the argument, because there was a conversation between specific people trying to make a specific point. And because we don't have that frame of reference, the point's lost on us, and it's lost on the translators, and they just leave it out. Now, I've given examples of this and how badly Heraclitus is translated, how badly Aristotle is translated, and so on. Certainly, God, how badly Hegel is translated into English from German. It just almost becomes gibberish in passages. As we attempt to make these writers fit our worldview, which they absolutely can't. You end up with Greenland being larger than South America or Australia, like on the Mercator projection. It's like, no, that's an island and that's a continent. Your sizes are completely wrong. It's like, yeah, but it had to fit on a flat map. So, what are you going to do? You end up with a mess. That's so I guess, part of what's in this is that, as part of why I'm trying to learn Latin now, and in a few years I'll add ancient Greek. I want to read these in the originals to try to see what they were saying before we translated the meaning out of them.
May I comment on your learning Latin? I don't think anybody else sitting at this table. I did 3 years of Latin in high school, and I passed it very well, right? Because
Right.
my dad thought I had to differentiate myself. After all, I wanted to go to medical school. That's one of the differentiators. But
Yes.
I have to say that Latin grammar is almost impossible. And the way I got around that, we had 2 set books, Julius Caesar and Homer the Iliad. And I learned those by memory. And in learning that, I was able to translate that to the grammar. Otherwise, the grammar is very dry. So where I got almost 100 on the set books, and I just barely marginalized 60% on the grammar, I passed the subject. And that was the goal. That was the goal. That was the goal. So I just want to pass that along. That maybe if you started reading the set books, then the grammar takes on a different life. That's my 13-year-old experience.
I see. I have classics envy, Sharon. You often on these calls you come on and you say, "Well, I don't know anything. You don't know anything. You just want other people to tell you stuff." But I know that that's not true. I know you have this educated background, and part of where that comes up is I wish I'd had a classical education growing up. I wish I'd learned Latin and Greek, but I didn't. Alas, there is a new movement in Latin teaching. It started in the 20th century, and it's been a minority movement the whole way, that says rather than teaching the grammar, memorizing the cases, and translating a page so we can pass a test, what if the goal was to be able to have a conversation in Latin? Just, whatever it is we wanted to talk about, we could fluently think in Latin and talk in Latin and hear in Latin. And so that's the approach that I'm sort of taking, is trying to.
And that's what the set book classes did for us.
Nice.
Allowed us to converse, right? Because it was the comprehension, it was the reading, it was the memorization of a passage and interpretation, sometimes in Latin. And so the grammar got simple.
Nice. So yeah, so I have Latin envy, Sharon. You're my hero. I want to follow in your footsteps. So, but my understanding is as declined and conjugated as Latin is, it's only about half as declined and conjugated as ancient Greek is. The ancient Greek, it's just shocking how many words can derive from the same root. And I did that exercise 2 years ago. I shared with the folks where we took the word gnosis, and that's the process of meaning, and from that derives gnoma, which is a thought that is created through gnosis, or a gnomon, someone who evaluates the world gnosically, and it goes on, a gnomata. There's this enormous variety of new terms can be derived from the same core concept. And in Greek, that's easy. They're all just suffixes and alterations. There's an entire world implied by every word because of all of the inflections you can get off of it. And in English, mostly we're missing all of those words. And we just, as they say, follow other languages down dark alleys and bug them for spare grammar, hoping if we throw enough bits and pieces together, we can cobble together what it is that we're trying to say. So I'm confident that if I eventually learn this stuff, I could go back and read Mark or Paul, and I will just, like, as with Heraclitus, which I can do now, from the very first sentence, I can see errors in the translation. It's some of the errors are so obvious and so bad when people translate Heraclitus that it's shocking that all the translators get it wrong until you realize that they're all moderns. Of course they got it wrong. They see the world the same way. So they have the same blind spots. And so they all react the same way. And so you see them, it's like that. The example is like, sophron arete megiste. Right. Let me put it in the chat. I shared that example, I think 2.5 months ago. Sophron arete megiste. Right. 3 words. That's one of Heraclitus. That's half of one of Heraclitus's fragments. And sopron is related to sophrosune. It's like the two ingredients of sophrosune are sopron and pronesis. Arete is the word that we always translate as virtue or excellence. And megiste is simple. It means the greatest, is the greatest. So this is saying sopron is the greatest arete. But what does that mean? Well, the modern English translators don't want to leave the word sopron behind because to them, translation is a game in which you eradicate the source language and are left only with the language you're translating into, in this case, English. Well, we don't have a word for arete and we don't have a word for sopron. So you end up with things like moderation is the greatest virtue, right? Which is 1,000 miles away from sopron arete megiste. Because an arete isn't a virtue in the modern sense. An arete is like the cheetah's ability to run fast. Their entire survival depends on it. It's the excellence that they're designed to cultivate by their character and by their culture in order to be able to live the lifestyle, the sustainable way of life of a cheetah. And by living that way of life, not only do they survive and the cheetah species survives, but the Serengeti thrives because of the behavior of the cheetah. And so arete is this rich concept that has to do with the relationship of the individual to the group and the present to the future, and what it is that we're interested in and take pride in and practice. The word virtue doesn't even come close to that. It's like we're just left with some sort of post-medieval sense of being good. And that's what virtue means to us. And if we think we're being clever, we translate back to the Romans and say virtue means manliness. It's your power or your strength. And it's like, oh, all of that falls so far short of the Greek concept of arete. And don't get us started on sopron, where sopron is the part of phronesis that has to do, it's the part of sophrosune that has to do with, do you know what is inside or outside of your way of life? Do you know what are the things that contribute to the success and sustainability of your way of life that you should be doing? The good things that your sophrosune would point you to if human beings had sophrosune, which we don't. Or do you know what are the things that are outside that way of life that you have no business doing? And if you do those things, it's going to wreck your way of life. It's going to wreck your life and your way of life and the larger ecosystem. It's like the cheetah has sopron because if you offer it the big red button to fire the nukes to beat all of its enemies and win, it takes no interest at all. It's like, I don't need the big red button. I don't want piles of cash. I don't want piles of Playboy and Hustler magazine. You give it all these things that motivate people, and the cheetah takes no interest in any of that. It has sopron. It knows what it should care about, even if it can't write an essay about it, even if it can't put it into words. It just naturally knows, taking a bath would be cool. Catching the gazelle would be cool. Taking a nap would be cool. Drinking some water would be cool. You know what's not cool? Pushing the big red button and firing the nukes. Of no interest whatsoever. And what Heraclitus is saying is things that Aristotle says later on, which is that you can't succeed at a viable way of life if you can't. I'm going to use the word they use in moderation, but it's totally the wrong word. If you can't moderate your own behavior to avoid the self-destructive things that are not part of your lifestyle that you should not be doing. The Navajo have these ideas. Hojon, the things that are Hojon are good. They're part of changing woman's path for the Navajo. They're the things that you should include in your life. If you want to do more of them, good. These are good things. You should do those things. These are Hojon. They can make up the bulk of your life and your life won't go wrong. Remembering to get clean, remembering to honor the dawn, remembering to be polite to other people. There's this whole list of traditional Navajo behaviors, and you can do those to your heart's content because they're Hojon. And then there's other things that are Naye, and we would translate that as evil, except that they don't mean the Christian evil or the modern evil. They mean things like morphine. If you're in a terrible circumstance where you need to stop pain, you can use a little bit of morphine measured out, as Sharon will say, measured out with the right doses, under the right frequency, under the right conditions, then it's appropriate to have morphine in your life. But only those conditions, only at those doses, only for those time, and then you put it away and you don't include it in your life anymore. And the Navajo say these things are naye, by which to them, to evil means these are the things that can't make up the bulk of a life, or they will destroy that life. They can be used very carefully and scientifically in moderation for protection, for healing, but then they have to be put away because they should not be part of a normal life. And Changing Woman was the one who taught this to the Navajo. She defined Horjon and Naya. She defined the rituals, and that allows the Navajo to have a way of life that's sustainable. So this is Sopron, to express this in Navajo terms, is knowing which things are Naya. What are the things that should not make up a part of your life for your life to be sustainable? So again, moderation doesn't even come close. That just sounds like if you live a milquetoast life and do a little bit of everything, you'll be fine. It's like, no, no, no. Moderation, the moderation in morphine would mean what? I don't take 2 grams of morphine a day. I take 1 gram of morphine a day because it's a compromise. Moderation is too empty a concept. It's mathematical. It's centrist. It's vague. It's arm wavy, and has nothing to do with the issue of what is my specific way of life, my culture's way of life. What is the sustainable, healthy way of life, which the Greeks used to distinguish Horjon from Naya, to use the Navajo terms. That's what Sopron is about. You'd have to write a book. There's no word in English that translates this. The only way you could possibly translate this into English correctly, if you wanted to do it very, very briefly, is to say Sopron is the greatest arete. And then the rest of the chapter would explain what is arete, what is Sopron. Add these words to your vocabulary, because you can't understand Heraclitus without having them, because we don't have words like this. But nobody does this. They just translate all the Greek out of it, and they leave us with the inability to say what Heraclitus could say in 3 simple words. This language was good at saying these things. Our language is bad at saying those things. And this is, in a nutshell, this is what Kenneth Smith's about in this book. This concept of different worldviews for different epochs is that each one has its strengths and weaknesses. Each one has things that it can think and say easily, but other things that it can only think or say with difficulty, if at all. And so what we're trying to do is profile each of these epochs and their worldviews to figure out, maybe if I want to talk about nature and a way of life and what the duty of a human being is within that context, maybe I shouldn't be speaking modern English. Maybe it would be an excellent time to speak ancient Greek, where I've got all these words to help me. But if I want to talk about salvation, maybe I should shift to a medieval framework. Maybe I should talk in Latin, church, specifically ecclesiastical Latin of the Middle Ages, because I bet there are things that you can say easily about salvation in ecclesiastical Latin that you can't say at all in modern English or ancient Greek. So they weren't designed to talk about these problems. So this is kind of what the book is sort of exploring, learning to see with these different frameworks. And that's why I want to learn Latin and ancient Greek. And that's why I envy Sharon, her Latin. I'm not worthy, Sharon. I want to be like you. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just really briefly. I mean, I think that's an important point, that as far as translations are concerned, and I think that what Ari was saying briefly about the idea of that we have more things and than technically than we've had in the past. So, and with that, that one would say, what is it that would be satisfactory, right? Then we start to think about those in those terms, and it is something where life is needs to be more than just utility, right? There is a need for something more. But there's also this other aspect of that. And I think that your example of the cheetah is a very good one, where it's something that it's sustaining. It's within nature itself. And while I do agree with the idea of utility not being enough, I do think that sustainability is something that is essential in that process. So, the example of companies similar to, like, say, Google or whomever. And the problem with companies like that, as being this kind of catalyst for salvation, so to speak, is that their incentive not to evolve and not to change, just like the power structures that then become in place. So if you think about it in terms of, does Google really benefit from another search engine or an improvement in search? Absolutely not. I mean, so they actually will keep God knows how much on their balance sheet, and extract. And what they're doing is they're extracting value at that point. And they're actually betting on things not evolving. So, I mean, what do you have? You have something that may, eventually comes along. You can say that chatbots have actually made a, kind of made a dent into their market. But my point is this idea of something being static and a salvation. Like, this is going to be the answer. Now, what's the answer is something that is sustainable, and what is sustainable is something that is on a smaller level and adaptable and not extracting. And what isn't sustainable is something that is extracting and growing and just needs to whatever. And what becomes the strategy? The strategy then would become, let's buy anybody that's a competitor. Now, how much different is that than just conquering something else, right? Well, we don't have that resource. We're unable to actually invent it on our own. We're not able to do this through organic means. So therefore, we have enough cash, or we can make sure that we do that on our own terms. So what I'm saying is, more than anything, is that you start to have this idea of the static, all-knowing deity. And it's not so totally dissimilar, right? In that once it's a structure that becomes in place. It's not an evolutionary spirit. It's not a search for truth. It's not something that reinvents itself. It's something that maintains. And what happens is, sometimes when the maintenance actually is when you're unable to maintain the current norms, well, then that's when it becomes not about what you have, but it's what you've lost. So, and that's when things break down. So what I'm saying is that sustainability, utility is not enough per se in and of itself, but we do need to have to make, we have to have progress of some sort, some meaning that we're actually moving towards, and nature actually enables that. So again, I think the example of something like a Google or something along those lines, or whomever, they can't be seen as the pinnacle or the answer to the world's problems, just as this all-knowing God can't be the answer to the world's problems either. It's got to be, something within nature itself, something that's adaptable. And so I think that's it was a good example as far as understanding that it's not just about utility. It's not just about what we have per se. It's about something more. It's about purpose. And purpose, you'll see something that will result from that. Maybe something material, but it's not about material per se. So I agree with the first part, but the second part is a little bit something that I don't necessarily agree with, because I think that we can end up, these deities can take many forms. So those, individuals that say, I'm going to worship the market. Well, it's only a matter of time for that. Let me know how that
Yes.
works out. And then the other individuals that say, I'm going to worship whatever, whatever it is that they, if you're only worshiping material things, then it's going to be problematic. But ultimately, I think that this comes down to this idea of sustainability. And that's where the idea that you want something that can reinvent itself as quickly as possible. And then from there, coming back to what you were saying about words, well, words actually have meaning. It's important to have the integrity of the words, because you need to know exactly what was being captured as a concept at that particular moment in time, because if you apply them to a system that's evolved and you extract it from something where you're now using something, it wouldn't, if you're applying a word in one context and the concept is actually not even being captured, I mean, it's going to be complete confusion. So the idea that if I define something in modern terms, bring it into the present, and say this is what it meant, it's going to end up horrible. I mean, because you'll actually be using your perspective, your concept, as opposed to actually capturing what the concept really entailed. And so the fidelity of words and language become paramount to not only understanding the past, but also moving into the future, and to returning and understanding what it is that you were doing in the first place. So, I mean, it's otherwise it can result in complete confusion.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, and perhaps not a coincidence, that in modernity, the I guess I don't even want to say de facto, the de jure position when it comes to language and change is radical descriptivism. And the premise of radical descriptivism is nobody is ever allowed to say they should be able to keep the definition of a word. Not even if, not even if there's no other way to say that thing. It's okay to lose the ability to talk about parts of the world, because the world doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is, what do other people want and how can you get them to pay money for it? And that requires radical descriptivism. You got to be able to go with the flow and constantly be assessing people's needs and addictions. But the idea of something normative, where it's not a matter of desire, but that people actually need something, this is alien to the market. And because of that, we make language an extension of the market and say it's not allowed to stick to meanings. It's why English speakers mock the French for daring to have an academy that controls their language. Like, how dare you say that you don't want to lose some of your words? We want you to lose the words. We want the market to eat your words away, and you're getting in the way of that, and that makes you an evil throwback. We're going to point and laugh. Haha, you still know how to say these things that we've forgotten. How wrong of you. Don't you know that all words ultimately end up meaning money or poop or sex? That's the goal of language, is to turn everything into things I want, things I don't want, and how can I do the exchange in order to get the things I want. I'm overstating the point and being unfair to the language of Shakespeare, but on the other hand, how often does it take a Shakespeare to pull off that kind of beauty in modern English? You can see why. Was it Yeats? Yeats, who called English the language of shopkeepers. Very good for setting prices and putting them on signs. It's a very thingly language. I have this thing. I want this much money for it. There are all kinds of issues in relation. So go ahead.
Very specialized.
Yeah, it's a specialized language designed to be the language of the market.
Yeah,
and
of things, like, in other words, even domain, like very specific domains and things like that.
I can imagine a future in which the dominant lingua franca is not English, except for financial transactions. And then when we're doing trade, of course, the liquid we would all use English for that part. Here's what goes on the sign, and here's what goes on the receipt, and so forth. And English is great at that. But you can sort of see the problem when you think about the way English has this great ability to borrow terms from other languages like Schadenfreude. That's a great one, or joie de vivre, and say, well, we were missing this term, so let's import it. But what we're importing is a single individual point of meaning. Whereas for the Greeks, every word was an entire constellation of meanings. You know, with just a change to the suffix, you could say a whole world of different ideas based on that word. And English can't do that. We sort of cobble together. We can do a little bit. We do a few tenses or a little plural versus not plural, and then we're out. We're done. You know, we borrow a term like joie de vivre, and how many grammatical transformations can we use to derive additional terms from joie de vivre? And the answer is mostly none. It's like you either say joie de vivre or you don't say it, and that's what you get. It's just this one point of meaning. It's clumsy.
It is.
Basically. And I've done some reading in Old Anglo-Saxon, and the language didn't used to be this clumsy. But this is the result of the train wreck with Norman French, and then 1,000 years of import of Latin and Greek in order to make it a church compatible language, and then the market for the last 500 years. The result is it's rigid and brittle, and it's a problem. And I say that with all love. I love the English language. I study it extensively, but it's got its issues, and one of the big issues that we run into is when we're trying to talk about the ancient worldview or the medieval worldview. There's so many things that we just can't translate into modern English. They just don't fit. There's nowhere for them, and there's no clean way to translate them into it. And the borrowing of terms doesn't do justice either, unless we borrow the term with the associated grammar. What we want is not just to borrow a term like arete, but we want to borrow the ancient Greek grammar so that we can get all the other aret related terms as well. We can get the 1,000 terms and not the one term. And then we're cooking with gas, but
yeah, that's really
mostly...
Arete is a good example. I mean, it's specifically in terms of excellence. We could make that so narrow in our current world as opposed to what it really meant in the Greek term. So it's just something where we completely distort what excellence really is. So it's something, we can even say related to a meal.
Yes.
And relegate it to something so particular that it's really no longer, its meaning is really lost.
Yeah, a good example of this is in one of Kenneth Smith's parables. I can't remember if it's otherwise. I think it's otherwise. Donald might remember. There's a parable that says anti-world, anti-time, anti-life, in which he's talking about how in the modern world, we use nourishing terms to describe non-nourishing things. Like how time used to be the way that we expressed our lives and our relationships with the world and each other. But increasingly, time becomes this zero-sum resource that we have to expend in order to earn enough money, in order to pay the rent, in order to be allowed to stay in the house that we're in, none of which ever gave us time to live a life or have the relationships that time existed for. And so he said, should we even call this time what moderns have, or should we call it anti-time? Because it exists to destroy the kind of time that people used to have before the modern world. He said, and then he does the same thing with the word life and the word world. And in another place, he applies it to the word culture. He says, if a culture is supposed to fit people into a way of life in the world that's sustainable with each other, then what do you call a culture that's designed to cut people off from the world so that they're just a whole bunch of needs and they have to work for the rest of their lives as a wage slave in order to barely or not quite meet their needs? He says, that's not a culture, that's an anti-culture. Its whole purpose is to deprive you of the things that a culture is supposed to give you. But under the modern terminology from anthropology, you'd call all of these things cultures because we're not allowed to make value judgments, even if the purpose of one of them is to absolutely destroy the whole reason that cultures exist. We're still not supposed to say anything. We just give it the same name. It's like not distinguishing between a saint and a sinner. It's like we use the same word for both. And if you try to make the distinction, we say you've made a grammatical error. You're not allowed to distinguish Jeffrey Dahmer from Martin Luther King Jr. You have to use the same word for both. That's proper grammar in the modern language, right? They're both just men.
the nourishing aspect of it is actually very interesting, because like if you equate wisdom to only in economic and transactional terms, then that nourishing, what you'll actually end up is it will only be in materialistic terms. So true wisdom and true knowledge, what is knowledge then, is that it gets lost in that kind of that aspect of kind of what the words actually mean. So what does it mean to be nourishing? What does well-being actually mean? Well, well-being was will often equate it to only in terms of an income. And that's such a lost perspective of what it really means, or what it means to live a good life, right? It was where you kind of started the whole today's session. So I think that understanding is that when we look at information and we extract from it only its economic value, then that gets to distorting as to what information and knowledge and actually wisdom really is. And so I think that that's an important, that's one of those things that I think is kind of what wisdom has been lost in information. That because you're only looking at it from value as a way of making material gains.
Yeah, wisdom is a great choice of words to look at this, to play this definitional game with, because you say, well, what does wisdom, Sophia, what does that mean to the ancient Greeks? And to the ancient Greeks, it all came down to sophrosune. The wise person was the one who understood and was committed to sophrosune enough that you could trust the governance of society to them. And you wouldn't want to trust the governance of society to anybody else who didn't understand the concept of sophrosune, or who held it in contempt and just saw it as something to manipulate. Those people shouldn't govern. So everything is about the sustainability of life, and how do you decide where human government comes from? In the medieval epoch, they turned it on its head. I mean, Jesus has sayings in some of the Gospels where he talks about the wisdom of the adult is nothing compared to the innocence of the child. And to be innocent before God means you're an open vessel, and therefore you're more receptive to the message of God, and therefore you're more likely to go to heaven instead of being tortured for eternity in hell. And so that's what wise is. Wise is not being wise. It's the opposite of being wise in the ancient sense. It's about knowing that none of that matters, and that you should trust the authority that tells you what God wants. That's wisdom, which the ancients would have called foolishness. And vice versa, the medievals call what the ancients considered to be wise, they call that foolishness. And then you get to the modern epoch, in which we consider both of those foolish. The only thing that's considered wise now is ruthless pragmatism, the willingness to screw your neighbor for a percentage so that you can get market advantage and make a larger income. That's wisdom. And that's why mafiosi refer to themselves as wise guys, because they're onto it. They understand that all these things other people value are of no importance, and the only thing that matters is how do you manipulate people in the system in order to get an advantage. That's wisdom, which again, neither the medievals nor the ancients would say. That is absolutely not wisdom. That is the epitome of foolishness. What is wrong with you? But this is what we mean when we talk about the incompatibility of the key loaded terms from these different epochs. They aren't just different from each other, they're directly antagonistic to each other. And the fact that we've got 3 examples, and Kenneth alludes in this book to the idea that it's not that these are the only 3 possibilities, it's that these are 3 documented epochs in European history, so we can work with them to get the general idea. But from the general idea, we understand that there must be many more worldviews that have been held that we could go looking for and try to understand. And if we do, we're going to find that wisdom means something different in all of them. And not just different, but again, so orthogonal as to be a kind of opposite. So this teaches us that opposites, we don't have to think in a one-dimensional way where there's 2 ends of the line and they're opposite to each other, because we start out with 3 in this book. So you can see that the 3 points of a triangle are opposite to each other. You can have 3 opposites. And of course, the implication is you could have 12, 100 opposites. They're all, what makes them opposite is that they're incompatible with each other. And the only way to understand and be able to talk about these incompatibilities and differences is if we start getting very precise about our use of language and clear about our frame of reference. So we can say, am I talking about medieval wisdom, modern wisdom, ancient wisdom, indigenous wisdom? Am I talking Babylonian wisdom or, Tang Dynasty Chinese wisdom? Which kind of wisdom do I mean? Until I add the modifier, the word wisdom is meaningless. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I mean, these things aren't just a little different. They're opposites. I need the context. So yeah, it's good stuff. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
The new wineskin. On one level, I'm looking at the Constantine adopted Christianity as the empire's religion. It bursts the old wineskin. There are a number of in the West. There are a number of Germanic successor states which all collapse or whatever. Now, the one that survived was the Frankish Empire. And the Frankish Empire, for example, is what made Anglo-Saxon Britain into a civilization. They adopted the methods of the Franks to create England. So the Frankish Empire leads the culture of the High Middle Ages. So this is one of the big candidates as to what is the new wineskin. This primitive Frankish Empire could continue doing what the old Roman Empire could no longer do. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's right on the money. Right on the money. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, yeah. I wanted to quickly respond to Joe about he was saying about specifically how the almost like Apple or Google are like deities, and they're like to some degree he was very nicely saying almost like false gods that people seem to put all their trust in, but essentially they're very rigid, static entities that are not going to be able to provide the solutions for what people really need. And I mean, I'd like to believe, maybe I'm being naive here, but I would like to believe that anybody who actually thinks about those companies immediately sees the same thing. Like they're like, there's no way those guys are going to fix the problems of the future, right? Like someone like Facebook, right? Nobody's thinking they're saving the world, no, right? But somehow the way we have so much, the way we use them and rely on them, that's kind of what we're saying with our actions, even if we're not saying it with our words. And so it's an interesting dependence on them for functionality at all. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine a world that where like the internet shuts down and all cell phones don't work. And like we have to go back and 30, like I can't imagine people doing that anymore. It just society would fall apart. And so but the interesting thing that these historians or philosophers point out are these data points that are huge aberrations, and they're actually pretty careful to say we don't know what this means. Kind of like I think Joe was saying, where you look at the value of these companies in terms of information, and that's one data point that's really big. But what's the series of data points that gives you a better story about what's happening? And if you look at them in this analytical way with a lot of data points, you can see that they're not any sort of entity that's going to save us. And not only that, they're highly dependent on the current entities that exist, which they're a substrate of. So there's no way they can do anything. And in fact, they're going to become rigid and set in their ways even just as fast as these other systems, right? So it's a very nice point. And in addition to what you've been saying about Sofer Sune, I wanted to think about this. This is a relationship that I think Phil was actually the one to say it the most. I missed Phil today. That Sofer Sune is sort of order and a type of flexibility, like a bendable material, an adaptive material versus a hard, unbending material. And the more structure you give your material, the more rigid it becomes. And that's what growth generally looks like. So growth means a lack of or a lessening of adaptability for the sake of having a more rigid structure that can hold a bigger load. And you just want to keep getting growth and growth and growth. That means you have less and less flexibility, which in a certain sense is like less Sophrosyne. So I wanted to point out the relationship that almost seems between growth and Sophrosyne, and this is why the cheetah doesn't have too many babies and doesn't, overpopulate the land. They're in a good dynamic. But another interesting point was, if you imagine the predecessor, and I'm sure my biology is wrong here, but just for the sake of a thought experiment, because it's a good idea. When does a tiger become a cheetah? Well, when all the animals on the Sahara are all gazelles now, right? A tiger is not equipped to do this, and therefore the animals that were a little bit less tiger-like in maybe random ways, specifically being able to be smaller and run faster, they were the ones able to get the gazelles, and then those guys bred. So it's only like within the tiger, he needed a certain amount of error, almost like a lack of Sophrosyne, to be able to genetically mutate randomly enough to be perhaps a little bit more cheetah-like. And eventually one day there were tigers and cheetahs, right? Because the environment says cheetahs are going to thrive. And so the tiger that was sort of naturally, randomly, perhaps through I assume it was random in the Darwinian model, but somehow maybe that they had a system of hunting that was just smarter and it was better for gazelles. It's hard to remove the information from the genetic complexity, but in a specific sense, like the tiger eventually became the cheetah, and so there was a certain amount of lack of Sophrosyne, and I wanted to point out that almost seems like chaos. So like error is like chaos, and Sophrosyne is more like order, a perfect set of order. And I'm not suggesting that it's static, right? It's an order that to some degree has variation, but it's always, the cheetah, like I think you would say the order in this case is the cheetah always hunting the gazelle and knowing how to do it right and when to not do it and when to wash and all the other things that make up its arete, right? And that makes up the cheetah. That's an order. That's a very specific set of ways of beings that cannot vary. And so that would be like a lack of chaos, right? So there's this relationship between Sophrosyne on one hand. The bigger the Sophrosyne is, the less chaos you have, and the more chaos you have, the less Sophrosyne you have. And an interesting relationship with that is that free will is basically chaos. Freedom to live a life, to do anything, to make any decision, is essentially chaos, because it's always different for every individual. Always, it's never the same. Right? So the amount of freedom in a society almost seems to be the opposite of Sophrosyne. If you're going to have more freedom, you have to have less Sophrosyne. You have to be more willing to think creatively outside of what your essential box is. And it seems like an interesting dynamic moving forward, like how like we as a society view freedom and free will as like the ultimate value. That seems to be, again, maybe the opposite of Sophrosyne.
Yeah, there's interesting things here. And part of it is this idea that the ancient Greek idea of Sophrosyne is flexible enough that it includes not just that you hold together as an individual organism, but that the organism that you hold together as can also hold together with other organisms to form
Yeah,
a
no, it means
whole.
like being a part of the environment, like as an ecosystem, right?
And it means as the
playing your part.
As the ecosystem changes, Sophrosyne has to change too.
Okay.
If it doesn't,
got it.
then it's not Sophrosyne.
So Sophrosyne is the tiger becoming the cheetah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just the cheetah being itself, but it's also the cheetah evolving over time. Those are both part of Sophrosyne.
So Sophrosyne itself is a relationship between order and chaos. You have a certain amount of order and a certain amount of variation.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where, the modern set of opposites is order versus chaos. But the ancient opposites are cosmos versus chaos. Yeah. Cosmos and order can be opposites because it's very easy to have stultifying order that prevents you from being a living organism. You get a dead, ossified society. That's not a cosmos. It is order, but it's not a cosmos. And if those are chaos is being juxtaposed against, then what becomes clear is that the definition of chaos also changes. The kind of chaos opposite of order is very different from the kind of chaos that's the opposite of cosmos. And so rigid order, for example, can be seen in the ancient worldview as a chaos. because it's incapable of adapting to the larger picture as a whole organism, which makes it a false cosmos. It's not a real cosmos.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay.
There's this nuance that the ancient Greeks have in their ability to talk about these things that is really hard in English, because the word chaos already means something. Because to us, chaos is the opposite of order, because we've got our law and order fetish that kind of defines, one of the critical.
I equate it to certainty versus uncertainty. Order is the perfect certainty that you know exactly, you can make a perfect prediction. The ball's going to go in the exact same path every time. Chaos would be like you can't tell where the ball's going to go at all. Complete mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly a big part of it. And part of it is resistance to change. And one of the reasons for resistance to change falls in what you're saying, which is a lot of people resist change because they're not sure what the consequences will be, and they want the certainty. And they fail to understand that during times of change, certainty has to be one of the things you let go of. You have to, because adapting to the new circumstances is more important than knowing for sure how things are going to come out. But an order fetishistic society can't give up that addiction to certainty, and so it insists on not changing and not adapting, and thus becomes maladaptive as the circumstances change out from under it. I mean, just really interesting paradoxes just all throughout these topics. And of course, this is all at the heart of Sophrosune. What does it mean to be alive, to have to have that symathesy, that learning relationship with the changing world around you that requires that you too change and adapt and move. Now, it's fascinating that there are Greek terms for all of these critical ingredients in a dynamic, sustainable life cycle. And again, we don't have any of these in English, and not modern English anyway. We don't have any way to talk about these things. Anyway, that's our 3 hours. We got through the first sentence. No, we didn't. We got halfway through the first sentence. Sharon talked for the first 2 sentences. Sharon talked us through them, but we haven't fully explored the questions that she raised there. So I think next week we'll pick up here again and move on. But I really enjoy having these conversations with you all, and I hope you enjoy them too. It's
happy studying the Latin. Enjoy the Latin.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful. Have a great week.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye. See you next week.
Great talking with you, Donna.
Yes.
Let's see. I better copy this thing.